Committee and to the Department expressing their support. By law, DOE must adopt the maximum improved standard that is technologically feasible and economically justified. That's what the law requires. A final rule for stoves is now 6 years overdue, and as part of the settlement, DOE must finalize new standards by next January. If finalized, the proposed rule would take effect in 2027, providing manufacturers with significant time to modernize any designs as needed. In conclusion, energy efficiency standards for household appliances and commercial equipment have been a cost-saving feature of American energy policy for decades. It's been working, and working well. The DOE should expeditiously finalize strong energy efficiency standards to secure real cost energy savings and long-term energy security for the American people. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today.
Thank you. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questions. Mr. Egan, you just heard Mr. Delansky say that if this rule goes into effect, there's still going to be a wide variety of gas stoves available for consumers. Do you agree with that statement?
No, like he even said, they're going to wipe out 50% of the market. 50% of the market will not comply with DOE's proposed rule. That is a substantial amount of gas cooktops. Of the higher-end cooktops, professional-grade cooking products, about 96% will be wiped out. So a large chunk of the desirable products with the features that people are looking for will be wiped out, and that will all go all the way down into the mid-range to low-range product as well.
But Mr. Egan, they said this is not a ban. My colleague said it wasn't a ban. We have a witness that says it wasn't a ban. So is it not a ban?
Basically, it's going to amount to just having a lot fewer choices, and it really be effectively be a ban in the sense that
so a de facto ban.
You basically will an indirect way of banning gas.
So over-regulating it, regulating to such a degree that it is in effect pretty much a ban, except for the 4% that already comply.
Right.
So the 96%, you're kind of out of luck.
You will get the choice that you probably don't want at the store, basically.
A choice for consumers. Right. Choice, interesting. Okay. Can you explain the versatility and performance of gas stoves compared to electric stoves? Because I love gas stoves. In fact, I was just talking to counsel. He's looking for a house. He wouldn't even buy a house unless it had a gas stove. And I tend to agree. And if I go to a place like a VRBO and they have a gas stove, I get excited. Right. It's just me, anecdotal, but you go ahead.
No. So gas stoves obviously are very versatile and have features that people want. The important thing is obviously people like having the immediate control over the flame, being able to control the cooking temperature, being able to react quickly. Temperatures can go up and down, and then also cooking a variety of products. If you're looking to cook on a high heat or sear, you can do meat or vegetables in that way. Looking to boil a large amount of pasta or any kind of rice, it basically makes it more efficient to do cooking. And also these cooking products are actually not just used for residential purposes. If you're a small business working in your home, it provides that level of versatility that allows you to work in your home business and get things done in that fashion.
So let's talk about like states that are calling for gas stove bans. New York comes to mind. Celebrity chefs are suing. They like their gas stoves. They're the experts with the culinary deliciousness that we as Americans like so much. They get exemptions for their businesses. Courts are even ruling in their favor. This is just outrageous logic. Why are celebrities getting favored treatment over everyday Americans?
Yes, obviously we would want direct use for access to natural gas in people's homes and the stoves in people's homes. It's clear that they're making these exceptions because it will economically affect towns and businesses that are looking to ban natural gas. They don't want to see those restaurants leave. And you're starting to see that in certain areas where restaurants are starting to push back, and that's why really the California Restaurant Association sued Berkeley to kind of make sure that the restaurant could still have access to natural gas in Berkeley, California.
Thank you. Mr. Lieberman, your organization has participated in the Department of Energy rulemaking over the last 20 years regarding energy and water conservation standards for home appliances such as gas stoves. How does the efficiency standard in the proposed rule violate the Energy Policy and Conservation Act?
The law is very clear that energy efficiency standards can't compromise product quality, choice, and features. And that clearly is at issue here. Gas stoves are much disproportionately burdened under this. Gas stoves will survive, but they'll have to cut corners in order to comply. They'll have to cut back on the very highest heat burners, as we've heard. And these are features that people want. They're on the market because people want. Essentially, the statute says if a feature is on the market before a standard, it has to remain on the market in at least one model after the standard. That's not going to be the case here. And regarding a ban, remember, Department of Energy and Consumer Product Safety Commission, both targeting gas stoves. The idea that two agencies going after stoves and we have nothing to worry about is just not realistic. You add to that natural gas hookup bans, which are now getting support from the federal government through the Inflation Reduction Act, $840 of taxpayer money for the purchase of an electric stove, zero for a gas stove, a whole host of measures opposed to natural gas more broadly, limited leasing on federal lands. It all adds up to a whole lot fewer gas stoves in the future if all this is allowed to be finalized.
And $840 for an electric stove.
I don't know how it works because some don't even cost $840. Yeah.
And maybe you get the stove and some money on
Yeah.
it.
We'll pay you to take the stove. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you all. Thank you, witnesses. And I now yield and I recognize Ranking Member Bush for her 5 minutes of questions.
St. Louis and I are here today to present the facts about gas stoves and the hazard they pose on our environment and our health. I think about my colleague says he likes gas stoves. I like gas stoves. We all like gas stoves. Seatbelts work too because there are standards put in place to keep people safe. This is a standard. This is we're talking about keeping people safe, and I like people to be alive, not necessarily what looks like a way to weaponize or to politicize an appliance. Let's keep people safe. So scientific research has proven there is a direct connection between gas stoves and, let's just take childhood asthma, finding that gas stoves are linked to 1 in 8 childhood asthma cases. These findings are especially concerning considering that asthma disproportionately affects Black and brown communities, like whole communities of people, humans. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, 13.4% of Black children have asthma, while only 7.8% of white children have asthma. New mothers heating up bottles or making pancakes could be poisoning their children without their knowledge. We want to keep them safe. This evidence linking gas stove emissions to negative health outcomes, it continues to grow. Gas stoves rely on natural gas or methane as a fuel source, which affects both the climate, both as fossil fuel source and as a greenhouse gas itself. So, Mr. Delasky, how does using natural gas as a fuel source contribute to the climate crisis?
Burning natural gas in our homes and in our power plants is a significant contributor to climate change emissions, and it's also a significant contributor to air quality challenges and problems indoors and outdoors. And in making our stoves more efficient would reduce combustion and reduce the emissions coming from our stoves.
Okay, Mr. Delasky, would improving the efficiency of gas stoves, would that help reduce the impact on the climate crisis?
Absolutely. Improving the efficiency of our gas stoves would help.
I wholeheartedly agree. A 2022 study by Stanford scientists found that annual methane emissions from all gas stoves in the United States, in those homes, our homes, have a climate impact comparable to the annual carbon dioxide emissions of 500,000 cars, with more than 3/4 of methane emissions originating while the gas stoves were not even in use. So, Mr. Delasky, what actions can manufacturers, can consumers, and regulators take to prevent the vast amounts of methane leakage from gas stoves?
One of the steps that we can take is for the Department of Energy to set the first ever efficiency standards for gas stoves. We now, for the first time, have a way of measuring relative efficiency and to ask manufacturers to make the investments to make their gas stoves that they sell more energy efficient, reducing their emissions.
One more question for you. What pollutants do gas stoves emit that are so harmful to human respiratory systems?
I'm not an expert in the various emissions that are coming out of gas stoves. I would point you to comments filed by the American Lung Association, as well as a number of nurses organizations and other public health advocates to the Department of Energy in the gas stove docket where they lay out some of the problems for indoor air quality and for ambient air quality. They're the experts, and I point you to that American Lung Association. They support the gas stove standard and are vocally supporting it.
Well, I'll just add, like nitrogen dioxide, which is known to irritate the human respiratory system. And as a nurse, I've seen it all too often, the effects. Further research we know is warranted. In the meantime, experts suggest several actions businesses and families can take to reduce the health risks associated with gas stoves. These include opening a window, using an exhaust hood, installing carbon monoxide detectors, and making the transition to electric stoves. Everyone should have the necessary information about their household goods to determine what is best for them, particularly their stoves. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Chair recognizes my good friend and colleague from Florida, Mr. Donalds.
Thank you, Chairman. First and foremost, I find it to just be highly disrespectful that the Department of Energy was asked to be here. They're not here. They don't want to answer questions about their own rule, which is going to impact the bottom line and the pocketbook of every American, especially those who own gas stoves currently. And, you know, I just find that to just be ridiculous. They must be taking a cue from the president, who doesn't even want to answer questions, doesn't do press conferences, and just is nowhere to be found. I find that to just really be laughable, to be honest. Secondarily, this whole gas stoves thing makes no sense. Mr. Stein, I think you were saying in your testimony that roughly only 4% of the current product in the gas stoves market would actually even comply with the EPA's rule. So if you are a homeowner or even a renter and there are gas hookups into the kitchen, what are they supposed to do? Are they now supposed to retrofit their kitchen for an electrical outlet? Because it's not a normal outlet with electric stoves. It is a specially designed outlet for the electric stove in the kitchen. So I would ask the Department of Energy, if they were actually here, what do you expect the American people to do with respect to their kitchen? Are they going to now retrofit their kitchen to allow for an electric hookup to go in there when the house wasn't designed for that? Mr. Delaski, what's the cost on that? Is that in your research?
The department has not proposed to ban gas
The
stoves.
department did not propose a ban of gas stoves, but the department is actually going to regulate the fact that most gas stoves on the market would no longer be able to be sold. They won't be allowed to be sold, only 4%. Do you agree with that, Mr. Delaski?
No, I've seen this movie before. Where
No, Mr. Delaski, this is not a movie, this is reality.
The claim is that...
Mr. Delaski, this is reality. Because if you're going to tell, let me bring it to you this way. If you're going to tell my mom that she can't have a gas stove anymore and she can only buy an electric stove, but there's a gas hookup in the kitchen and now the kitchen has to be remodeled, and we were renters, we were not owners, which means the landlord had to go and redo that. Do you know what that's going to do to her livelihood? What happens if the landlord says, man, I got to go through these massive retrofits, I'm not paying for that. It falls on the back of the renter, which is what does happen. Does that sound like a movie to you? No, it doesn't. I'm not even asking you a question because this is ridiculous. This is not a movie. These are people's lives. And we have the Department of Energy who doesn't even have the guts, the courage to come in here and answer questions about their proposed rule. They'd rather hide in their building down the street than come in here and talk to the American people, talk to the people's representatives. I mean, we do have to fund the Department of Energy. That's coming up in a couple of months. If you can't even come in here and answer questions, why would we fund you? And that's serious. I'm not even joking around because this thing is stupid. For Black and brown communities, the cost of actually having to go out and buy a new appliance or to retrofit your kitchen is far more dangerous to your bottom line and to your pocketbook. I'm being honest, far more dangerous. I noticed in the ranking member's comments, she never once mentioned what it would cost a Black and brown family. She didn't talk about that. All she's talking about is the fact that the entire Green New Deal agenda may, and I stress may, cut 1/2 of a degree in the world's climate by 2050. And I stress may, because there was a representative from the Department of Energy in the Senate a few weeks ago, and he could not even answer the question that came from Senator Kennedy. He didn't know. He had no answer. He was like you, Mr. Delaski, just going back through this is not a movie or whatever the heck you're saying over there. This stuff is dumb. Listen, what we should be doing is a couple of things. Number one, making sure that there is actually cheap and readily affordable energy for our businesses and for our people, period, full stop. Two, this notion of chasing down the Green New Deal fantasy, which, by the way, half the globe is ignoring. China is not doing this. Russia is not doing this. And the Europeans are backpedaling from this quickly because even the Europeans now understand that they can't live their Green New Deal dreams on gas that they were getting from Russia. They don't get to do that anymore. So now Europe is backpedaling. We need to get serious in the United States. And if we want to have an economy where everybody's got to be able to earn money in, and we want to have an energy grid that is sustainable, what we can't do are these crazy demands from the Department of Energy and from the EPA. Last thing I'll say is this. If we follow the president's dream and the other party's dream of electrifying every car and electrifying every stove, you know what we're gonna have? We're gonna have an electric grid with not enough energy to turn the lights on. Those are the facts. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Donald. This chair recognizes Ms. Brown from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today, my friends on the other side of the aisle are unfortunately spreading unfounded fear-mongering about gas stoves. As someone who uses a gas stove, I want to address some myths. First, the Biden administration, again, is not banning gas stoves. I repeat, the Biden administration is not banning gas stoves. The Department of Energy is not banning gas stoves. And in fact, the Department of Energy cannot ban stoves through energy efficiency standards. Instead, consistent with the law, the Department of Energy is proposing standards that would improve the efficiency of gas stoves built in the future. Mr. Delasky, to your knowledge, will new conservation standards affect existing stoves installed in homes and businesses across America?
No, it will not.
Thank you. Mr. Delasky, can you describe some of the benefits related to the improved efficiency of gas stoves?
The improved efficiency of gas stoves would cut bills for consumers. For a gas stove owner, it's going to save them about $50. And for an electric stove owner, about $75 over the life of the stove. Those are, if you saw $50 lying on the ground, you'd pick it up. And that's what the government's doing by setting efficiency standards for gas stoves and for electric stoves, too.
Thank you. Mr. Delasky, why is it important for the public to have accurate information about the energy conservation and health impacts of the products they use?
Consumers having information is what helps them to make good decisions that are best for their families. And one of the things that we accomplish with these standards is allowing people to understand what is the efficiency performance of different products in the marketplace so they can make the choices that are best for their families. While they still have and they will continue to have a range of choices, just make no mistake, both electric and gas products once the standard is in place.
Thank you so much for that. Listen, experts have long held concerns about the impact of gas stoves on human health. It is unacceptable that nearly 13% of childhood asthma is directly connected to gas stove emissions. To be clear, while the Department of Energy works to improve the efficiency of stoves, we can all take steps to reduce the potential health risks associated with their use by doing small things like turning on a vent or opening a window. As mentioned, one of the essential services of our government provides is to review consumer products and identify ways to make them cleaner and safer. That's exactly what the Department of Energy is doing, making sure that gas stoves are less expensive to operate and produce fewer toxins and health hazards. It is my hope that my Republican colleagues will redirect their focus to the well-being of American people rather than politicizing kitchen appliances. Because you know what they are banning? Abortions. You know what they are banning? Books. You know what they won't ban? Assault weapons. But we are sitting up here talking about a ban on gas stoves. But I should be excited because if my colleagues are interested in an appliance that is causing harm to children's lives, perhaps they will get the courage to have a hearing about banning assault weapons, which are actually killing people every single day. So yes, I agree. This is dangerous and dumb. We have much better things to focus our time on. And with that, I yield back.
Chair recognizes Mr. Moskowitz from Florida.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I appreciate the waiver onto the committee. And first, let me say, from a policy perspective, I think my colleagues across the aisle are correct. I don't think we should ban gas stoves. And I don't think banning gas stoves is the least impactful way to address the gas nitrogen or carbon monoxide or formaldehyde that's coming out. It's ventilation. Ventilation is the way to address that. And so I'm here to say, Mr. Chairman, that I agree with you that we should not be banning gas stoves. And the good news is that this proposed rule doesn't ban gas stoves. And I get it. I get that every morning, you know, as you're getting your coffee, you know, and it's warm and you're in the kitchen and you stare into the knobs of your beautiful stainless steel beauty. I got it. I get the bravado. We can pry your gas stove from your cold, dead hands, or give me my gas stove, or give me death. You know, I have a 6-burner double oven range that sits on legs. I mean, I miss her right now as we're talking about it. And so I think, because it's a two-party system, I think when my colleagues across the aisle, the other party, show leadership, the leadership of our times that is desperately needed, Democrats like myself should commend them. And I want to apologize on behalf of the Democratic Party that we have decided to put kids' safety in their neighborhoods, from getting gunned down in movie theaters or grocery stores or school churches or synagogues. We as Democrats have clearly lost our way, that we are not focused on appliances. And so we're finally seeing our friends across the aisle stand up for parents all across the country as they tuck their kid in at night, as they dress them for school in the morning, as they are worried that they may not come home. My friends across the aisle are telling those parents, you can breathe a sigh of relief, that the grand appliance party is going to make sure your gas stove goes nowhere. You might own a small business, and you are worried about how you're going to pay your employees if we default. The good news for you today is that if you have to shutter your business because the country defaults, your gas stove will still be there. And so, you know, I look forward to the legislation of our time, the Appliance Bill of Rights that might come in front of this committee, and joining in this fight together as we show Americans that Congress can still do big things, that we have not lost our way, and that when the American people need leadership from their elected leaders, we are going to deliver for them and their gas stoves. Mr. Chairman, thank you. I yield back.
Chair recognizes Ranking Member Bush for a close.
As we have heard over and over again, this is not a ban on gas stoves. This is not a ban on gas stoves. This is not a ban on gas stoves. We would love to see actual action that saves lives, but we continue to see from our Republican colleagues actions that loosen regulations, that make it easier for humans to lose their lives, make it easier for humans to become ill. Gas stoves have an enormous impact, a negative impact on the climate and on humans' health. We've said it over and over again, including contributing to childhood asthma, and that's a big deal. Respiratory illnesses are a big deal. Energy efficiency standards benefit American consumers by lowering the risks that are associated with gas stoves and saving them money on their utility bills. The Department of Energy's proposed rule on energy efficiency for consumer cooking products is part of the normal course of business, and it is required actually by law. The proposed rule is also part of an effort to catch up on the long overdue updates to energy efficiency, those standards that fell to the wayside during the Trump administration. The proposed rule also has the support of consumer protection organizations such as Consumer Federation of America and the National Consumer Law Center. I would like to request unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter from these two organizations submitted for this hearing. Yes.
So moved.
Thank you.
Without objection. So moved.
I also would like to highlight an important point raised in the letter, and I quote, "Inefficient stoves raise important equity concerns. If DOE fails to adopt strong efficiency standards for stoves, it will leave millions of renters who are disproportionately low income compared to the population at large, consigned to having less efficient stoves installed with consequently larger energy bills." The proposed efficiency standards are not a ban on gas stoves, again. The department does not want to, nor can it, ban gas stoves. The Biden-Harris administration has specifically stated that it is not in favor of banning gas stoves. Republicans are deliberately misrepresenting the facts and misrepresenting data, all while focusing on this made-up war, let's call it that, on gas stoves and ignoring far more pressing issues for Americans across the country. We're about saving lives. That's more important than what we're seeing about how comfortable it is to have a gas stove in the manner that we have them now. It's okay. New technology comes out, new information comes out. I think we should move forward with that. And we don't have to ban gas stoves to do it. Consumers should have all of the relevant information, all of the important information that they need to make an informed decision about appliances in their own homes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Representative Moskowitz for coming in and giving his testimony. He was waved down in the committee. He actually was one of the 29 Democrats that voted with the Republicans to prevent this rule from going into effect. So I want to thank him for his support as well on this. So I figured at the beginning of the hearing that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle would say either this is not a ban or regulating them out of existence. It's something that because it isn't a ban, it's a regulating out of existence. That's what it is. So I would partially agree. Or they would say, this is something climate change demands it, so we're going to command it. This is something that we're going to make mandatory. But actually, they did both. And some of the salacious and ridiculous and hyperbolic claims, like the Republicans are against safety, I mean, that's absolutely absurd. This is about taking away choice. And every time you take away choice, you take away liberty. And it seems to me the only choice that many of our Democratic colleagues are comfortable in allowing the masses to have is abortion. Everything else, it's best left to the elites. And this is not a ban. Yeah, it's, again, regulating them out of existence. And what they do, they cite wild and hollow savings claims. And I prefer, if we're going to give someone a choice, do you trust the American individual or do you trust an unelected bureaucrat? And this, again, comes down to, is it the rule of law, which is I thought we were supposed to be a rule of law nation, or is it the law of the rule? And then we were told gas stoves are are hazardous, or they're disproportionately harming people of color, or they're dangerous, or they're poisoning, and their gas stoves kill. So I guess by implication, gas stoves could be racist. Or are they just better to help us scramble some eggs and make some crispy bacon? This is about, at the end of the day, choice. And it's clear the American people simply don't want these opaque and complicated rulemaking standards that the Biden administration is putting forth. Nominee after nominee that President Biden puts forward has faced serious opposition or straight-up rejection, because this is extreme. Just take the sinking of the nominee for the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, for example. We would have loved to have him testify on the proposed rule issued today, since his office would be having to sign off on it. But as you can see, there are 2 empty chairs that the Department of Energy was asked to come, and they just, again, thwarted the request of Congress. Concerningly, these agencies are moving forward with overreaching, ideologically driven rules without the consent of the American people. And then they won't even come to answer questions from the American people's elected representatives. I would be just as angry if they ignored it under a Republican administration. The Department of Energy is even relying on court-ordered consent decree initiated by environmental groups as a basis for staying out of this hearing room today. And let's get real. Agencies avoiding accountability is a theme we've seen through this Congress from this Democratic administration. We saw it last Congress with a Democratic majority as well. The reason for this behavior is the Biden administration knows it is politically exposed and compromised. This is an uncomfortable hearing. We hear this from our colleagues about, don't we have better things to do than talk about appliances and gas stoves? We're talking about liberty and we're talking about freedom, but this is the same party that had, I think, 3 hearings with this committee about the Washington Redskins and Daniel Snyder. I think we had a little more important things to do than harass that man. I get, what are they called now? The Commanders? I don't even know. They'll forever be the Redskins to me. Republican legislation protecting consumer choice has talked many Democrats out of supporting the Department of Energy's proposed rulemaking. Again, as I mentioned, this is bipartisan support to kill this rule. 29 Democrats joined all the Republicans. So, meanwhile, we have Energy Secretary Granholm herself has defended bans against gas stoves, although she has one herself, which is at the height of leftist hypocrisy. So do celebrities in California who are suing for exceptions to have their gas stoves in kitchens. Can you imagine suing to keep a gas stove in your kitchen? This is absurd. This is where 10 years ago, I don't think any of us saw. There's plenty of topics today that 10 years ago we would have thought there was no possible way that we'd get there. One of the key principles of our great country is we the people, not we the bureaucrats. That's kind of a dictatorship of the bureaucracy, quite frankly. Free markets determine what we want for ourselves and our families and our communities. And people and Americans are free right now to have a choice. You can have an electric stove if you want, or you can have a gas stove. I want to thank the witnesses for their participation and contributing to this meaningful discussion today. I look forward to scheduling a follow-up hearing with the Department of Energy, and maybe then they'll actually show up and do their jobs and be held accountable to the American people. They do cast a check, and that check is written by the American taxpayer, and at which time we hope that they'll appear and they can answer our questions. And with that, and without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days with which to submit materials and to submit additional written questions for the witnesses, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. If there's no further business, without objection.
Mr. Chairman, I apologize. I don't know if I was waved in at the beginning. Would I be allowed to submit? Okay, then I'd like to be able to submit mine for the record too. Thank you.
You're welcome. Without objection, so ordered. If there's no further business without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.
Without objection, the chair may declare a recess at any time. I recognize myself for the purpose of making an opening statement. Today, excuse me. Today's hearing is an opportunity for this committee to leverage an important tool in combating waste, fraud, abuse, and mismanagement while safeguarding taxpayer dollars. That tool is the Government Accountability Office 2023 high-risk list. The 37 areas contained on this list represent programs within the federal government where there is a high risk for fraud, waste, abuse, or mismanagement. The list measures progress and deficiencies so that Congress can take action to conduct meaningful oversight and make those programs more efficient. Federal government programs created and funded by Congress must fulfill their intended purpose and meet mission objectives while being careful stewards of taxpayer dollars. Yet too often, massive federal programs struggle to meet their objectives and become vulnerable to fraud and abuse. The high-risk list is a critical tool for evaluating whether the programs created and funded by Congress are working as designed for the American people. The Government Accountability Office, or GAO, publishes this report at the start of each Congress. GAO's high-risk report provides status updates on how programs are performing and recommendations on ways they could improve. The 37 areas on the list all present either a financial risk of loss of at least $1 billion taxpayer dollars, that's a billion with a B, or a risk involving public health or safety, delivery of essential services to Americans, national security concerns, economic growth, privacy, or the rights of citizens. Important things are at stake here. Despite GAO's best efforts to highlight problems and propose solutions, waste, fraud, and abuse in the federal government is ever present. GAO has supplied this report to Congress for more than 30 years. Unfortunately, some programs have appeared on this list since the beginning. Fortunately, this committee has returned its attention and resources to focus on its core missions: to ensure government is working for the American people in an efficient manner, to ensure agencies safeguard taxpayer funds from fraudsters and ineligible participants, and to hold leaders accountable when they fail to perform. This committee's very first hearing of the 118th Congress, which included testimony from Comptroller General Dodaro, focused on the rampant waste, fraud, and abuse in COVID relief programs, leading to billions in waste and improper payments, with tens of billions of funds going to transnational criminal organizations instead of their intended recipients. Today, our committee will also examine the roughly $250 billion lost to waste, fraud, and abuse and mismanagement annually outside of COVID relief programs. This includes improper payments in the Medicaid and National Flood Insurance Program, waste due to outdated cybersecurity measures and a lack of preparation for future disasters, mismanagement of Department of Defense's finances and in the federal prison system. All of these programs have been highlighted in the high-risk list. GAO's work makes clear we need to have more oversight, tracking, and data collection to determine how taxpayer dollars are being spent. GAO estimates that just since last Congress's report, there's already been about $100 billion in federal savings because of improvements to areas included on the previous high-risk list. And why is that? Because effective oversight works. It works to expose and prevent waste, fraud, and abuse. It works to safeguard taxpayer dollars, and it works for the American people. We made a commitment in the 118th Congress to restore accountability, not only with this committee, but the entire House of Representatives, and that's what we're here for today. I look forward to hearing from Comptroller General Dodaro on the work GAO is doing and how this committee can seize opportunities to prevent waste, fraud, abuse, and mismanagement in the federal government. And with that, I yield to Ranking Member Raskin for his opening statement.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for calling this very important hearing with the GAO on its recently released 2023 high-risk list. For more than 30 years, GAO has released this list at the beginning of each Congress. The report identifies key areas where we need to ensure that the federal government works effectively for the American people and not effectively against us. So the report's been a North Star for government efficiency, illuminating a path forward for Congress and the executive branch to better serve the needs and the priorities of the American people. I want to thank Comptroller General Gene Dodaro for testifying before the committee today and for his extraordinary 50 years of exemplary service of the people at GAO. That's a half century committed to the American people. I want to echo the chairman in saying that GAO's independent, nonpartisan work is critical to the mission of efficient government, serving the public and rooting out waste of taxpayer money, financial fraud, and self-dealing abuses of power. GAO plays a pivotal role in this process. The list identifies the areas of federal operations most in need of transformation and improvement. Every 2 years, GAO rates progress or backsliding from the last report and makes specific recommendations for executive branch agencies and Congress where we can make progress. The recommendations save American taxpayers billions of dollars, improve service to the public, and strengthen government performance. Since 2006, the financial benefit of addressing these high-risk areas has totaled a jaw-dropping $675 billion. Let me repeat that. Addressing the high-risk areas has provided taxpayers $675 billion in financial benefits. If Ben Franklin was right that a penny saved is a penny earned, that's $675 billion earned to the American people, an amount 100 times more, I observed this morning, more than 100 times more than Fox is going to have to pay Dominion for what just happened there. So investing in our federal operations, in oversight, in leadership, in practical solutions, and in resources yields extraordinary concrete benefits to the American people, including better customer service, a more efficient government, and these billions of dollars in savings. The 2023 list highlights 37 areas across the federal government that are at greatest risk today of waste, fraud, and mismanagement, and that need broad structural reform. When we look at the 2021 high-risk list, 16 high-risk areas saw improvements, and 2 were removed from the high-risk list entirely. According to GAO, this is the most progress made by Congress and the government since GAO started issuing the ratings 8 years ago. Progress can be seen in directly improved services to the public and in the agency's enhanced ability to achieve their missions. This is tangible evidence of the Biden-Harris administrations and the Democratic majority's commitment to work for the American people and deliver meaningful results over the last Congress. While we're encouraged by the progress outlined in this year's report, there's much more work to be done, of course. Since 2021, 1 high-risk area regressed and 3 new problem areas were added. This is a reminder that we have to do more to hold the agencies accountable. We hope the majority and our colleagues on both sides of the aisle will work together to implement lasting solutions. This means we must ensure continuing key investments in our operations and implementation of policy changes. This public philosophy must take precedence over the suddenly fashionable drive to dismember our country's critical programs, including the social safety net, healthcare, science, education, climate, energy, labor, research, and oversight itself, as outlined in the short-sighted, penny-wise, and pound-foolish debt ceiling proposal. The so-called Limit, Save, Grow Act, better known as the Default on Our Debt Act, would make destabilizing and indiscriminate across-the-board cuts of an estimated 22% to most agency budgets, plunging the government into uncertainty and triage mode without the resources to continue making improvements in the high-risk areas. These slash-and-burn cuts proposed by House Republicans threaten to reverse dramatic progress made in the high-risk areas and make many of our problems worse. They would undermine the crucial progress we've made towards addressing the skills gap in the workforce, defund our work to protect the nation from devastating cyber attacks, pit safety and efficiency against each other in our transportation systems, slow down Social Security checks, and cause significant reductions in the number of people served by affordable housing programs. And this is the tip of the iceberg. These cuts would even eliminate millions of dollars in funding for oversight of pandemic aid and for the oversight work that the Comptroller General is here to tell us about today, oversight work that we all claim to value so much. Members in this hearing room cannot say that they want the federal government to best serve the American people and then walk over to the Capitol to vote for a bill that will totally frustrate this goal. One agency official stated the cuts would, quote, cause significant damage to national security, economic competitiveness, American jobs, disaster preparedness, and the natural environment. Instead of implementing widespread cuts that would halt most of the gains made on high-risk areas between 21 and 23, executive branch agencies in Congress need to believe in the value that comes from a well-functioning federal government, a government that serves everyone. Executive branch agencies in Congress must commit to addressing hundreds of open GAO recommendations to bring about the lasting corrective solutions we need to the remaining 37 high-risk areas. Persistent and prudent congressional oversight and thoughtful legislative solutions are essential to achieve greater progress. Mr. Chairman, I look forward to working with you on making that happen, and I yield back.
Ranking member yields back. I'm pleased to welcome back to the committee today's witness, Comptroller General Gene Dodaro, who brings more than 49 years of experience at the U.S. Government Accountability Office and has served as head of the agency since 2010. As Comptroller General, Mr. Dodaro helps oversee the development and issuance of hundreds of reports and testimonies each year to Congress. These products have led to hearings and legislation, billions of dollars in taxpayer savings, and improvements to a wide range of government programs and services. He has testified before Congress dozens of times to provide nonpartisan insights into some of our most pressing federal oversight issues. His leadership with GAO has led to billions in taxpayer savings and crucial evaluations of whether government programs and services are meeting congressional intent. Thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to our discussion this morning. Pursuant to Committee Rule 9G, Mr. Dodaro, will you and your staff please stand and raise your right hands? Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony that you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record show that the witnesses all answered in the affirmative. We appreciate you all being here and look forward to your testimony. I recognize Mr. Dodaro to please begin his 5-minute opening statement.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Raskin, members of the committee. I'm very pleased to be here today to talk about our latest high-risk update. The story of this update is progress, but many pressing, serious, consequential problems still need to be addressed. On the progress front, and I would commend the Congress for a number of things that they did to contribute to this progress. First was to provide funding to the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, which is coming off the list. Congress also provided funding for surface transportation, dealt with some fiscal relief to the Postal Service over this past year, passed a number of provisions to build better climate resilience up front, and this dealt with many of the issues, and it contributed greatly to the progress, as well as efforts by the executive branch. Now, there's progress in 16 areas, 2 of which we're going to take off the list. One is the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation. When we were here last time, the multi-employer program was due to be insolvent in 2026. And due to the action that the Congress has taken now and some improvements that have helped in the single employer program, the PBGC now rates the risk of insolvency very low for the next 15 years. So we're going to take that off the list. Now, just because it's off the list doesn't mean it's out of sight. We're going to continue to monitor it because it doesn't solve the long-term problems in that program. We're also taking the 2020 census off the list because of improvements made. This was the first census with an internet response. They were able to contain the cost growth in annual censuses from the pattern that had emerged earlier. They delivered it during a pandemic. There's still a lot of issues in terms of the quality of the count that need to be worked on going forward. Again, we'll keep an eye on this area as planning for the 2030 census ramps up going forward. Now, there are a number of areas still on the list that I think are very significant that I want to point out to you. Number one is cybersecurity. And I first added that to the high-risk list across government in 1997. I still don't think the federal government's operating at a pace commensurate with the evolving grave threat in the cybersecurity area, not only to protect its own assets, but critical infrastructure protection throughout the United States. Administration has just put out a national strategy that we've been calling for, but it does not yet have a detailed implementation plan with milestones, resources, clear roles and responsibilities. So we're going to need to continue to focus on this area. We have 850 open recommendations yet in the cybersecurity area that we've made. And so that area is very important, I believe, for Congress to continue to focus on. The second is drug misuse. We added this area a while back. Very concerned in the last 12-month period that the CDC's been measuring. There have been over 107,000 overdose deaths. This is the most in the history of the United States. It's been over 100,000 now for the past 2 or 3 years. The trend is not good. We've called for a national strategy with coordination not only among federal agencies, but between federal and state and local governments, the healthcare sector, the law enforcement sector. Just this month, earlier, the Office of National Drug Control Policy put out an emerging threat alert because of the combination of fentanyl with xylazine, which is a horse tranquilizer, has becoming very problematic in this area and leading to additional complications. So they have to put out a report now within 90 days on how they're going to do with this next evolving issue in this area. Lastly, I'll point out the area of oversight of medical products and safety. Most of our products now come from foreign sources. We've encouraged FDA to have more oversight over that area, and I think we still are at risk of drug shortages, and the medical supply chain issue needs to be dealt with much more effectively than it's been dealt with before, and we have some suggestions on how that could be done. And so I'm happy to talk about any of these high-risk areas in the question and answer section. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today to discuss these very important issues with all of you, and hopefully help set the oversight table going forward.
Thank you very much. We look forward to a very substantive question and answer session, and I'll begin. Mr. Comptroller General, what is the total amount of improper payments that GAO estimates were made last year across the federal government?
Last year across the federal government, the cumulative total of the estimates made by the agencies was $247 billion. Now, I don't believe, Mr. Chairman, I might add, if I might, that estimate's not complete. There are a number of programs that estimates were not made, like the Pandemic Unemployment Insurance Program. Since 2003, these estimates have totaled $2.3 trillion. This is a trend that was a problem before the pandemic. It got worse during the pandemic.
2.3 trillion. So since 2000, it'd be roughly $2.5 trillion.
Yes.
$2.5 trillion. What are the worst programs for improper payments over that time?
Over that time, Medicaid program has the highest total for the last couple of years. $98 billion in 21, $80 billion in 2022. Medicare program, it's about $49 billion over the last 2 years. The unemployment insurance program at $78 billion in 21, about $19 billion in 22.
Jeez.
Unemployment insurance, the earned income tax credit has been about $18 billion a year. And then in 2022, which was the first year, the emergency loan programs at SBA were a $36 billion estimate. We encouraged them to make that estimate. They didn't make it in 21, but they made it in 22.
That's sickening. Last Congress, we heard from you about the need for more oversight over pandemic relief funds. As you testified at the 2021 high-risk hearing, and I quote, "When you're spending close to $1 trillion, you also need good accountability and transparency," end quote. And guess what Congress did with that important advice that you gave this committee? It rushed out another $1.9 trillion in alleged pandemic relief. But Congress didn't stop there. Congress also spent another $2 trillion of taxpayer dollars in Green New Deal spending in the infrastructure package, CHIPS and Science Act, and our favorite misnomer, the Inflation Reduction Act, which I'm not even going to get into that. As with any massive spending bill, oversight is critical to ensure that funds are being used towards their intended purpose. What has GAO learned about the federal government's ability to conduct internal oversight since your last high-risk update, and is the federal government truly equipped to oversee the disbursement of trillions of dollars under such a short time frame?
There are additional areas that I've recommended, both to the Congress and the executive branch, that need to be dealt with. First of all, the agencies need to implement better fraud reduction measures. That's the only real solution to this problem. It's difficult to catch all the people that committed the fraud afterwards, and then even more difficult to collect the money. So with the agencies, I worked with the Congress back in 2016. We passed this Fraud Reduction Act, and the agencies were slow to implement it. So they weren't very prepared for additional funding. You need better internal controls, better management, more aggressive oversight, and I have about a dozen legislative proposals that I have to help deal with this issue going forward.
I look forward to receiving that. So thank you for your insight. As I mentioned earlier in my opening statement, many of the issues we face today began long before the pandemic. The 2023 high-risk report served once again as an alarming reminder of the extent of the improper payment issues facing Medicare and Medicaid. Last year, Medicare improperly paid roughly $47 billion, and Medicaid improperly paid nearly $81 billion. Why do these programs have such massive issues with improper payments?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of factors that contribute to it. In Medicare, what needs to be done is there needs to be more timely measures of the contract audits for Medicare Advantage, which is about half of the spending in Medicare now. CMS still hasn't released the audits from the 21 to 2015 or 2011 to 2015 area. So we're way behind in auditing the managed care plans.
That's unacceptable, by the way, but yeah.
I agree. There also needs to be legislation to allow for recovery auditors, which have proven through a pilot to do some pre-audits ahead of time. I've suggested more pre-authorizations, which have been studied and don't hold up benefits but provide more program integrity. In Medicaid, I don't believe the estimates, as bad as they are complete. I don't think we have a good estimate yet of the managed care portion of Medicaid program. There's a big problem with provider screening and beneficiary eligibility determinations. This was paused during the pandemic. So once that resumes, which starts this month, I expect those improper payment estimates to increase, but that needs to be dealt with, and I think the state auditors need to be involved more in providing oversight over that program, which is administered at the state level.
Well, thank you. We look forward to your legislative advice and look forward to this hearing. With that, I yield to the ranking member, Mr. Raskin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I get complaints all the time from constituents about the Medicare Advantage plans and what's taking place in there. So that might be worthy of a hearing of our own, Mr. Chairman, and the fraud that's taking place there. Mr. Dodaro, one of the criteria that you consider before you remove an area from the high-risk list is agency capacity, specifically whether or not the agency has the people and the resources needed to sufficiently address and correct the risk. Why is agency capacity such a critical factor?
Well, first of all, 22 of the high-risk areas of the 37 are on the list because of critical skill gaps, either not having enough people or the right kind of people to implement those programs effectively. So you need the right people.
You're talking about people on the staff of the agency.
Absolutely.
Under the American Rescue Plan and the other coronavirus relief laws, GAO got $107 million to bolster oversight of the funds and programs authorized by these packages, some of the stuff you were just talking about with the chairman. My understanding is that the GOP's default on our Debt Act, however, would claw back a lot of that oversight funding money that had been provided before to the GAO. How much money would be taken back?
I'd have to provide a detailed answer for the record. I think we have perhaps around 20 million of that left of the 107. You know, a number of
But what had been reported to me was 29 million, but I wanted to check.
Well, that's
it with
about
you.
right.
Okay.
That's right.
Now, that's money that you intended to use on essential oversight of COVID-19 relief, including examining the content and management of the Strategic National Stockpile, evaluating agency IT preparedness and response during COVID-19, assessing airline service disruptions and their causes, and investigating significantly worker health and safety conditions in the meat and poultry processing industry. This funding will help us understand what happened during COVID and how to better prepare for future emergencies. On top of that, these proposed dramatic across-the-board budget cuts would undermine GAO's ability to oversee the 37 high-risk areas that we're here to talk about today. So last month, you testified before the Committee on Appropriations and stated that, quote, Congress is basically out-resourced against the executive branch. And unless you have strong oversight and a strong GAO, it's hard to provide effective oversight. At that same hearing, you described the severe challenges that you experienced after the last drastic budget cuts took place under the 2011 Budget Control Act. So how would these new budget cuts affect GAO's ability to conduct the oversight that we're all counting on?
Yeah. Well, potentially, the cuts collectively that have been discussed would have a devastating effect on our ability to support the Congress. Under some of the proposals that have been put forward, we would either have to lay off about 570 people, or we'd have to not replace people left through attrition and furlough GAO people. We'd have to shut GAO down for about a month and a half and for providing services. So it would definitely have an impact on us and our ability to serve the Congress.
I mean, is that cutting off our nose to spite our face?
Well, we provide $145 back for every dollar invested in us over the last 5 years, and so we provide a very good return on investment. And to get the returns, you got to continue to make the investment. It'd be like pulling your money out of a CD and still expecting interest.
Yeah. So I just want to get our colleagues to focus on this point. Like, there's the level of rhetoric at which a lot of politics in Washington takes place, and then there's the level of real investment in work to make things happen. And this reckless default on our debt act would gut funding, not just for veterans and housing and nutrition and climate work and so on, but for important oversight work which saves billions of dollars to our people and make sure that the government is working for our people. And that's just unacceptable, and it's not going to be productive. So if our colleagues really want to make government more effective and more efficient, if they really want to improve the programs and the services that we provide to our constituents, let's not undermine key oversight entities like the GAO that provide accountability and transparency to Congress and to the American people. That really is cutting off our nose to spite our face. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Chair recognizes Mr. Gosar from Arizona for 5 minutes.
Comptroller General, it's good seeing you again. Absolutely. U.S. involvement in Ukraine has been an epic disaster, resulting in hundreds of thousands of military and civilian casualties. Each day without peace is another day that jeopardizes the fragile security the world has enjoyed for decades, free from the devastation of nuclear weapons. But our blank check for this war is coming at a cost of our own military readiness. At our current pace, it will take 5 years to restock our Javelin missiles, 13 for Stinger missiles. Every 1 month, 6 years' worth of our 155-millimeter artillery rounds are expended or disappear. The horrible decision to give American taxpayers' dollars to a corrupt regime is not the only reason why the U.S. military readiness is suffering. The recent GAO report has found 4 critical areas where our DoD is at risk of losing over $1 billion due to mismanagement, waste, and fraud. Mr. Darrow, let me quote a line from your report. The Department of Defense needs to improve oversight of its weapons systems and to make better informed investment decisions to ensure the timely delivery of critical capabilities to the warfighter. Mr. Darrow, given that fact that the U.S. munition stockpiles have been significantly depleted, How has the decision to meddle in this foreign war on the other side of the globe affected the military readiness of the U.S.?
One of the things that we've been asked to do is provide oversight by the Congress on what's happening to the funding that we provided. And one of the things we're going to look at is that very issue, particularly in terms of replenishing the stockpile. I'll ask Mr. DiNapoli, who's our expert in that area, to elaborate a bit, Congressman. It's a good question.
Many thanks for the question. It is good. As Gene mentioned, we are kicking off a series of reviews to take a look at what type of weapons and assistance has been provided to Ukraine. As of last month, $39 billion and over 75 different types of goods and services have been provided to the Ukrainian armed forces. As part of that, we are going to look at the replenishment of those, how the decisions were made to what to replenish, how to replenish it, what's the cost of that replenishment, and the impact on sustainment and readiness.
So,
Congressman, excuse me, we also have work ongoing looking at the readiness issue. We've been focused on that a number of years now.
gotcha. So now, in your discussions with the DOD, have you noticed a special push to restock ammunition and weapons?
Yes, in our early observations, in our discussions, they're definitely focusing on making sure that the supplies of critical things that are needed by our armed forces are available when needed.
From your vantage point, are they at acceptable rates?
So we're continuing that. We're continuing that analysis. I can't give you an answer right now, but we hope to have that report out to you by the end of the year.
Love to have that. Now, there have been over 107,000 drug overdose deaths in fiscal year 2022. Much of this death is due to policies that perpetrate open borders. Has GAO issued recommendations to the Department of Homeland Security on steps that the agency could take to deter illegal border crossing and to more easily and effectively return illegal aliens to their country of origin?
Yes, we have. I'm going to ask Charles Johnson to come to the table, our expert in that area, or Rebecca Gambler, I'm sorry. You can go back.
Good morning. Thank you for the question, Congressman. Yes, GAO has made a number of recommendations to DHS over many years related to its efforts to secure the border. Those recommendations include things related to better oversight and monitoring of border security efforts, better performance measures so that we can assess what we're getting out of investments made in border security, and we're continuing to follow up on those recommendations over time.
So can you commit to a report by GAO on policy recommendations Homeland Security should take to stem the tide of illegal immigrant?
We would be happy to work with your office on specific areas of interest that you're interested in GAO taking a look at and reporting on.
Gotcha. Now, my last question. Many prisoners are being held, allegedly committed crimes on January 6th of 2021. They're being held in deplorable conditions in 2 D.C. jails. There are reports that the prisoners are prevented from seeking counsel, had their freedom of religion violated, been denied medical care, refused access to exculpatory evidence, and been forbidden basic hygiene products to keep themselves groomed and washed. Are you aware of these violations of prisoners' rights?
I'm going to ask Charles Johnson to, he's our expert in this area in the Bureau of Prisons. Go ahead, Charles.
Thank you. Congressman, we have not specifically looked at that particular issue. We have been doing some studies looking at the federal management of the prison system, which you know is included in the high-risk report this year as a new addition. We are aware of some mistreatment of some of the incarcerated individuals at certain facilities. The particular one in the district we have not looked at, but we'd be happy to take a further look at that.
Would you commit to a report to Congress on that very subject?
We would definitely look at it and reach out to your staff to have a further conversation on that issue.
Thank you very much. Good seeing you again.
Good to see you.
Chair now recognizes Ms. Norton from Washington, D.C. for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the 117th Congress, Democrats led the way with historic legislation to rebuild and modernize our nation's crumbling infrastructure. Congress passed the Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act to rebuild roads and bridges in communities around the country, improve climate resilience, clean up pollution, and a lot more. During the first year of implementation, the Biden-Harris administration has already started delivering results. Over $185 billion in funding has been committed to more than 6,900 projects across the country. So, Mr. Dodaro, can you give a couple of examples of how the Bipartisan Infrastructure and Investment Jobs Act contributed to significant progress across several high-risk areas?
Yes, absolutely. And I've called up David Trimble, our infrastructure expert. But first I would say, number one, surface transportation and providing stable funding over the long term has been on the high-risk list since 2007. And so the Infrastructure Act provided enough money to provide stable funding at least up until 2028. After that, there's going to be a funding gap again, which is why we didn't take it off the list. Also, the Inflation Reduction Act did provide a number of programs and grants to build climate resilience in up front. And so those are two ways that they make contributions to those areas. I'd ask Mr. Trimble if he has any additional examples.
I think those are the two examples I would cite as well, but we're happy to meet with your staff to give you other examples we've seen in our audits. We've got a number of reviews ongoing, tracking the funding across a whole host of areas. So be happy to meet and go over those in more detail if that would be useful.
I'd appreciate that. Mr. Dodaro, what concrete benefits did this progress deliver for the American people?
Well, I think the infrastructure, by our accounts and by many experts in that area, was desperately in need of repair, particularly for surface transportation and bridges and other things. So I think, these projects take a long time to get developed, and there needs to be, more work done in order for everybody to realize fully the benefits that are in place. And so but the funding needed to get out there and get started in those areas. I think climate resilience will yield a number of benefits, both to individuals as well as the federal government. Also, the expansion of broadband capabilities throughout the country, particularly in rural areas, will help people realize the benefits of connectivity in those areas. And so, we've pointed out, though, that we need to look at the workforce to make sure there's an adequate workforce to deliver these broadband capabilities throughout the country. So we looked in the telecommunications area, and as David mentioned, we have about 30 or 40 different requirements for studies on the Infrastructure Act, so we'll be continuing to put those out. We've already issued one report, for example, on crash dummies, and saying that the dummies, while they represent men in particular, they don't really represent women or children, and so there's more study needed and changes need to be made so that the full range of occupants of cars can be made safe.
For the high-risk area of funding the nation's surface transportation system, GAO did not provide a rating for executive branch agencies' progress because, and I'm quoting, addressing the identified issues will primarily involve congressional action, end quote. So, Mr. Dodaro, can you explain what funding the nation's surface transportation system is about and why we should take heed that this area is on the high-risk list?
Yes. Well, the national gas tax hasn't been raised since 1993. So the purchasing power available, the model that was set up by the Congress is to have occupants and users of the roads and highways pay for the funding repairs. And that model, with the fact that the gas tax hasn't been raised, more people, fuel-efficient vehicles, now electronic vehicles, that model is not going to be sufficient, has not been sufficient in the future. Congress has supplemented the amount of money going into the Highway Trust Fund by making general appropriations available. And now the Infrastructure Act covers that for at least the next 5 years. But the long-term financing really is not there. Now, we're looking at some of the the efforts to look at the mileage driven and to perhaps have a different model of people paying a certain amount of money for the miles that they drive every year. There's some pilots going on throughout the states. We're not sure whether it's going to be scalable yet. That's one of our recommendations to the Department of Transportation.
So I yield back.
Chair recognizes Dr. Fox from North Carolina for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Dodaro, for being here. This year, the unemployment insurance UI system was added to the high-risk list. In the report, you mentioned that fraud risks to the UI program need to be addressed. As I understand it, the current statute of limitations for criminal and civil penalties for COVID-era UI fraud and overpayment is only 5 years. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Legislation such as the Protecting Taxpayers and Victims of Unemployment Fraud Act would extend the statute of limitations for criminal charges and civil actions for prosecuting fraud to 10 years. What would the impact of that change be, and how much more could we expect the government to be able to recover as a result of this change?
Well, I think that that's a good change. Congress has already extended the statute of limitations for the SBA emergency loan programs from 5 to 10 or maybe 10 years. And I think it makes sense to do it for an unemployment insurance area. You know, we estimated at the low end of the fraud and unemployment insurance, it was $60 billion in fraud. We're working on a high-end estimate now, which we'll have later this summer. So there's a lot of money yet that hasn't been recovered. Now, how much can be recovered? Quite frankly, it's going to be modest. But I think there's also a benefit from a deterrence effect about punishing people who have committed the fraud, as well as trying to get back as much money as possible.
Absolutely. As you know, the United States Postal Service has been on the GAO high-risk list since 2009. However, since the last high-risk list was published in 2021, this committee came together to create the Postal Service Reform Act, which was signed into law. This law greatly reduced the Postal Service's unfunded liabilities for retiree health benefits. Along with this, quote, relief, the Postal Service is charged with implementing the Postmaster General's 10-year plan, which we believe will lead the Postal Service towards self-sufficiency. Do you have any recommendations for Congress to help ensure the Postal Service achieves self-sufficiency?
Yes. I think that the long-term need, well, first of all, Congress did provide substantive relief to the Postal Service, but it didn't change the long-term business model. And the Postal Service is continuing to lose money even with these relief efforts. So the 10-year plan being executed by the Postal Service will be helpful, but ultimately I think the Congress is going to have to decide what level of service that it wants the American people to have and how to provide a stable funding arrangement and whether or not they want the Postal Service to be self-supporting.
Let me ask you a follow-up before you continue that.
Right.
The high-risk list mentions that USPS should continue to take actions under its own authority to enhance its financial viability while still meeting its mission to provide universal postal service. What actions under its own authority can USPS take to enhance its financial viability?
I'll ask Mr. Trimble, our expert, to give you an answer there.
Thank you.
Yeah, currently we have ongoing review of the USPS's new 10-year strategic plan and the number of projects they have in there to address their costs and also service and reorganization efforts they have underway to address their cost structures. So I think really it's going to be to execute against that plan, and that's something we'll be monitoring in our ongoing review.
Great. Mr. Dodaro, again, one of the key points made in the high-risk list is that the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, is critical to addressing high-risk areas because it can lead and support agencies. How can Congress help OMB conduct more meaningful oversight to help improve high-risk programs? And along with that, I'll note that there's no Inspector General there. How would having an Inspector General help this situation?
Well, first, I think OMB, the first thing Congress could do is hopefully work with the administration to get a confirmed controller in that position. There hasn't been a confirmed controller in that position for at least 7 years now. And that's a problem in terms of us working with them to not only deal with high-risk areas, but also improper payments and also all financial management issues. So I think that there needs to be additional leadership responsibilities there. I've been very pleased with the cooperation from the Deputy for Management, Jason Miller. We've had tripartite meetings between GAO, OMB, and the agencies on the list. OMB's always looking for resources, just like everybody else, so Congress should look carefully at those issues. Inspector generals are an important part of oversight over the federal government. And I would, think that some consideration, and there is some merit to considering that, although OMB is in the office of the president, executive office of the president, so you'd have to look at it in a broader aspect than just OMB, because OMB is a very small entity.
Sure. Well, I have one more question, but I'll submit it, Mr. Chairman. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Dodaro.
Thank you.
Were you wanting to speak? Okay. Chair recognizes Ms. Ocasio-Cortez from New York for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to yield 30 seconds to the ranking member, Raskin.
Thank you kindly, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez. Congress committed $24 billion in security assistance to Ukraine in their war of self-defense against the brutal invasion by Russia. And to ensure the proper use of that funding, Congress and the administration established robust oversight structures to detect fraud and abuse, and that included additional funding for the IGs of DOD, the State Department, and the United States Agency for International Development. And recent testimony from administration officials confirm that these robust oversight structures are working. On February 28th, the House Armed Services Committee held a hearing during which DOD's Undersecretary of Defense for Policy testified the agency has provided Ukrainians with supplies to track the systems the U.S. has provided, including scanners and software, and that they have not seen any evidence of diversion. So I just want to say that you have helped us get ready for that. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you to the ranking member. Now, I want to dive into a little bit of what we're looking at today. This week, Republicans introduced their legislation to bring the United States government into default. That is what is happening. And that would introduce a destabling and profoundly unprecedented process that would initiate across-the-board cuts of an estimated 22% to most agency budgets, including cuts to life-saving medical care, Social Security, student debt, SNAP benefits. And in all of that, my colleagues seem to forget another way to solve our impending fiscal crisis. This isn't just about continued cuts to the poor and to the working class in our essential services, but we can raise revenue. In fact, in tax cuts in 2017 passed by the other side of the aisle, we see wonderful tax cuts for yacht owners and private jets. But in order to balance our budget now, we're talking about cuts to SNAP, to food out of babies' mouths, instead of actually re-examining the inequities within our tax system. Let's look into the decreasing IRS's revenue that has contributed to a loss in revenue from taxing the wealthiest Americans. Mr. Dodaro, how much have appropriations for IRS enforcement activities decreased since 2010?
I'm going to ask Jay McTighe, our expert in IRS, to respond.
Thank you.
Thank you, Congresswoman. The appropriations for IRS have declined considerably since 2010, roughly 20% when adjusted for inflation, and roughly the same amount when looking at enforcement in particular.
And we've seen, according to your May 22 report, Mr. Dodaro, GAOs, you reported a decrease in audit rates of individual tax returns, correct?
That's correct.
And in that same report, you state that the tax community has also raised concerns about whether the IRS is selecting taxpayers for audit in an equitable manner. Can you explain the concern with respect to the equity of audits and particularly any drops in audit rates for incomes making over $500,000 a year?
I'll ask Mr. McTighe to respond.
Again, thank you, Congresswoman. In the report that you referenced, we did point out that audit rates have declined by about a third since 2010 across the board, but they have declined more dramatically for higher income individuals. And the reason behind that has really been a resource and a capacity issue. Auditing high income, high wealth individuals, partnerships, corporations require a lot of expertise, both human capital as well as information technology and analytics, whereas auditing lower income individuals is much more straightforward. The IRS has a lot of information from third parties on income such as wages and less information on other types of income. So there's a wide disparity there.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And to your note, auditing the rich is an enormously complex process that takes a lot of manpower. And the cuts to IRS enforcement are strategic, and they have resulted in a loss of revenue. Is that correct?
IRS has been unable over the past decade to backfill, very highly skilled individuals.
Thank you. I apologize. I just have to reclaim because I don't have time. But what we see here, and I'd like to submit unanimous consent to submit the report from the GAO, that there was an 87% decline in audits for taxpayers making between $500,000 and $5 million. And according to the GAO, we've seen that the new funding for the IRS that we've recently put in the Inflation Reduction Act has increased those revenues over 10 years. So instead of looking at climate and instead of looking at cuts to health care, we should examine why our colleagues in the Republican Party is so invested in protecting the wealthiest people in this society and would rather attack health care and services for our veterans than repealing tax cuts for yacht owners and private jets. And with that, I yield my time.
Chair recognizes Mr. Grofman from Wisconsin for 5 minutes.
Yes, I'd like to focus a little bit on the Department of Defense, arguably the most important department because our freedom depends upon them doing a good, efficient job. First of all, the Department of Defense financial management and contractor management have been on the GAO's high-risk list since the early 90s. Why is that?
The financial management part, and I'll ask Mr. DiNapoli to talk about contract management, but on the financial management, they've been unable to pass the test of an independent audit. They're the only major federal agencies that have been unable to pass the test of an audit. Their financial systems and controls are not sufficient. There have been hundreds of identified weaknesses by people who are doing the audits now. For many years, the department didn't try to do a financial audit. But in the last 5 years, they have, and they're making some good progress in that area. They're finding good benefits from the financial audits. They're finding helicopters they didn't know they had on the books. They're finding lots of supplies. They're saving some money for not reordering things that they already have. So there's some benefits to it, but the main reason is they haven't been able to pass the test of an independent audit, financial audit.
Why compared to other agencies is the Department of Defense so much worse? Is it arrogance? Is it ignorance? What would you attribute it to?
Well, a part of it's scale. For a number of years, it was lack of effort, to be honest with you. I mean, the requirement's been in place since 1996. For about a decade or so, they really just certified they were unauditable and didn't do it. More recently, there's been commitment in the last 2 administrations, and I've been very pleased about it. And they're starting to take it seriously. They recognize they need it in order to manage more efficiently and effectively. But it's a big agencies, and there's not a lot of standardization across the department. So there's a lot of decentralized efforts, and therefore the systems are unable to exchange information properly.
Thanks. In November of 2022, Defense failed its 5th consecutive audit. It was unable to account for 61% of its $3.5 trillion in assets. What are the reasons why the DoD can't produce a clean audit?
A couple of reasons. One, their financial systems are unable to, or are not reliable in a number of cases. Secondly, they don't have good internal controls over their property, over their inventory systems, and that's a problem. They also don't have the full type of skills in their workforce that they need in those areas, and so it's a myriad of issues.
Could you elaborate on they don't have the skills? How is it possible they don't have the skills?
Well, there are not enough people. I mean, if you haven't, this is the issue. For over 200 years, the federal government operated without any financial statements or independent financial audits. We started in the 90s. So this wasn't a big priority in those areas. And then for a number of years, the department didn't think they needed to do this, and so they didn't build the capacity that they need in those areas. Most of the expertise in financial management in the federal government's been in the budget area, not in preparing financial statements and auditing, or to have the systems people necessary to produce those statements. So they're trying and they're making improvements, but I still think they need additional skills to be able to do this.
And we'll jump ahead here. What's the dollar figure for waste the GAO has identified at the Pentagon? And this number will include the GAO alone and not include the Department of Defense Inspector General's numbers.
Yeah. We're working on a figure now for government-wide waste. So far, the only figure we've come up with has been for the unemployment insurance program, which is over $60 billion at the low end of the range.
Okay. Department of Defense last estimated that in 2014, contractors were in possession of $220 billion in government-furnished property, but GAO says that number is significantly understated. Why does GAO believe that?
I'll ask Mr. DiNapoli to respond.
Thank you for the question. It's a lot about the similar issues that Gene mentioned with regard to financial management also occur in the property management system. So having the proper records, having the information technology systems to govern that process, and then having the folks to do the proper oversight of those, all combined to having information about the amount of government property in contractors' hands probably being excessively low.
Okay, I'll give you a little different question. I sometimes feel, they always say generals are fighting the last war. And I look at stuff like aircraft carriers, which when they have war games get sunk right away. Do you guys have any comments on the Department of Defense, or maybe even shouldn't say the Department of Defense, our Appropriations Committee and Armed Services funding weaponry that may not be up to snuff or wouldn't last very long in a 21st century war?
So thank you for that question. And that is another high-risk area in our weapons systems work, which has also been on the high-risk list since 1990. And what we've continually found through the past 30 years is the Department of Defense continually buys weapons systems in a manner that results in cost overruns and schedule delays, and often doesn't provide the warfighters what they need when they need it.
Thank you very much. I think I think our Department of Defense, and quite frankly, some people in this building, are a little bit embarrassing as far as protecting our country. But thank you for letting me go a little over.
Chair recognizes Ms. Stansberry from New Mexico for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to welcome Mr. Dodaro. It's wonderful to have you here today, and thank you to all the staff who are joining us. Mr. Chairman, I just want to take a moment to say thank you for having this hearing. This is exactly the kind of hearing that this committee should be having, is actual oversight and the fiscal responsibilities of the federal government. And I'm particularly grateful to have all of you here and to have this discussion as a former Senate committee employee and a former examiner at OMB. I'm very familiar with your work and have actually worked with a number of you over the years, so it's great to have you here today. I want to start out by saying, as the representative for New Mexico's 1st Congressional District, many of the items that are in the high-risk list for this year are items that, of course, New Mexicans experience every single day. Of the programs and items that are listed under high risk, issues around tribal communities and their access to health care, funding for the Bureau of Indian Education, issues around access to disabilities programs through Medicaid and through through the VA system, and of course, many of the issues around military spending and the other issues that have been discussed this morning. So I want to dive in on some of these issues here, but I do want to take a moment to amplify on some of the comments that were made earlier, in that it's particularly peculiar to be having this hearing this week, as we learned just this morning in the wee hours of the night last night, the GOP in the Rules Committee dropped their version of the debt ceiling negotiation, which is really a ransom note for many of the programs that we're talking about that are covered under this report. In fact, in the name of balancing the debt ceiling, the GOP is proposing to cut for 10 years federal programs across the board. And in the GAO's high-risk report, it's acknowledged over and over again across the hundreds of pages of this report that part of why we've made progress on the high-risk list is because we've been making investments, and particularly congressional investments in these programs. And in particular, I want to highlight those investments in climate change, since one of the proposals in the GOP's proposal this week is to gut the Inflation Reduction Act, as well as other programs. In a 2019 report that the GAO published, it was estimated that by 2040, that climate would cost the United States $315 billion a year. And the GAO said in this report that for every single dollar that we spent on climate change as the federal government, it would save the federal government $11. That's an 11-to-1 investment. So when we hear arguments like we have this morning that investments in climate action are a waste of taxpayer dollars, they are literally saving taxpayer dollars by ensuring that we are mitigating financial and fiscal risk for the federal government down the road. And in fact, the report that you've issued actually states that. In fact, I want to take a direct quote from the report. It says that congressional action has helped to improve this high-risk area, and then goes on to talk about the ways in which the infrastructure bill and presumably the Inflation Reduction Act are actually going to help mitigate fiscal risk to the government. So I really wanted to amplify that this ransom note that the GOP has issued this week on gutting these vital social programs, climate programs, are really going to undermine the fiscal responsibility of the federal government. But I do want to allow the opportunity for you to share some of the findings of the report, especially around climate change. I know there were 5 key areas that were in need of improvement, particularly around government-wide planning and technical assistance to our communities. It's something that I work on every day. I have a number of bills that I'm working on. And so, Mr. Dodaro, could you and staff please expand on some of the key things that we can do to address our fiscal responsibilities around climate change?
I'm going to ask Mr. Gaffigan to do that. He's our expert in the area, but we've got some good ideas.
Great.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at our high-risk designation on climate, it's about the fiscal exposure. So you're spot on in terms of highlighting that. And the federal government can provide a lot of incentives to build resilience in and save those dollars that you're talking about. It can also be an integrator for all the stakeholders who are involved in that, and also provide key information. Those are 3 sort of key areas of resilience that we can build in. But I think the fiscal exposure is a huge issue, and it's why we put it on the high-risk list in 2013.
Yeah, I think a couple specifics. One would be to give better climate information to state and local officials so that they can make better planning decisions. Also to work with them to build the better building codes in. You know, the federal government does not control the building codes. And so it's very important that the federal government try to provide information to get those building codes up to speed. And also the federal government needs to set priorities. There's a lot to do here. And we need priorities. We can't, that would help us to make the most optimal investments.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. And we really appreciate your work on this issue. And as I said, this is a significant investment in the future of this country and mitigating financial risk to our country's fiscal health, but also to ensuring that our communities have a livable planet. And so we appreciate your work highlighting that. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Chair recognizes Mr. Palmer from Alabama for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Dodaro, good to see you again. You and I have done a lot of work on some key issues, particularly in the high-risk area, and I just want to know, it's been very frustrating, the lack of response in some cases, and I just want to know if there's some common themes or patterns that you have noticed across high-risk areas when compiling the list in recent years.
Yes, one thing is the programs that rely upon state and local administrations are among the most difficult to deal with. This would be Medicaid, unemployment insurance program, because we allow the states to design their own programs within certain parameters. So it's very difficult, and a lot of the federal agencies have a little bit of a softer posture in terms of oversight when there's a lot of responsibilities delegated to the state and local government, but you really need federal leadership in a more aggressive manner. So that's number one. Number two is I think there needs to be more resources brought to bear and more disciplined management of federal programs and activities on spending in normal programs, but on emergencies, which we've have had and will continue to have. And that's the basis for the 10 legislative suggestions I put before the Congress.
Well, in regard to the emergency, it raises a question about the government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Has that worsened our ability to manage vulnerable funds? And you mentioned one of them, the unemployment insurance fraud that took place on a massive scale.
Yeah, no, it's definitely, the pandemic exposed fundamental management weaknesses that the federal government has in the payment process in normal times. One is the emphasis has been on pay and chase in the fraud area, rather than preventing fraud in the first place. I've tried to change that, working with the Congress and the agencies. We're nowhere near where we need to be in preventing fraud in the first place.
Well, that's some of the stuff that you and I have worked on over the years is how do we incentivize federal agencies to prevent the improper payments that I think you're really talking about right now, the pay and chase. And I think one of the things that GAO pointed out was that so much of that is just failure to verify eligibility on things, right. Poor paperwork, just administrative errors, but also antiquated data systems.
Right.
And I'm still interested in pursuing a way to incentivize agencies rather than punish agencies that don't pursue this. But what is the GAO's current estimate of improper payments?
The government-wide estimates based on what the agencies have done for the last fiscal year was $247 billion. The previous year was $280 billion. But as I mentioned to the chairman, those estimates aren't complete. So I think the number is much higher.
So, okay, you estimate it's much higher. Let's just say it's between 250 and 300 billion per year. Just at a static level, we're talking over a 10-year period, $2.5 to $3 trillion. And what people need to understand about this is $2.5 to $3 trillion over 10 years that we're having to borrow and pay interest on. And when we're trying to deal with the debt limit and trying to get our fiscal house in order, recognizing the enormous impact it's going to have on our capital markets, that's a pretty significant number. That's a pretty big hill that we need to climb. And I'd like for the committee to continue to work with the GAO to come up with a way to incentivize federal agencies to address this issue. I think one place that we could start, Mr. Chairman, is on updating the antiquated data systems, because part of the problem I think, Mr. Dodaro, you and I ran into was the lack of ability for interface between data systems between state and federal government. So I think we've got some real opportunities here. I have some other questions I may submit in writing relative to some of the things that my Democrat colleagues have said that I want to evaluate a little bit deeper. But I do think that we don't pay enough attention to how much money is going out of the Treasury in improper payments, and we're doing pay and chase rather than prevention. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Ms. Ballant from Vermont for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for being here, Mr. Dodaro. Appreciate your time. The Postal Service is a lifeline for rural communities like mine in Vermont. My neighbors in Vermont rely on Postal Service for essentials like medication and for many folks who run small businesses, out of their homes. And the continued viability of the Postal Service, especially in rural parts of this country, is one of my top priorities. Now, thanks to leadership on this committee, including our chairman, Mr. Comer, and former chair, Carolyn Maloney, the Postal Service Reform Act of 2022 was actually a really great bipartisan success story of the last Congress. And I want to dive in a little bit more on the Postal Service. Mr. Dodaro, how long has the Postal Service been on the high-risk list?
The most recent, I think, was 2009 we added it. Actually, if you go back in time, we added it a long time ago. I'll get you the specific date, but then we took them off after some congressional action, but then they deteriorated further. I remember because I actually was called by the Postmaster General at the time, and I was acting Comptroller General at that time, and he actually asked us to consider putting them back on the list.
Yeah.
And we did. We made our own independent judgment.
And Mr. Dodaro, how did the Postal Service Reform Act in 2022 contribute to the significant progress in the high-risk area, so that we can understand that a little bit better?
Yeah. Well, it eliminated the requirement for pre-funding health care benefits, and it forgave the amount of money that they owed to that fund in that area. It also shifted some of the responsibilities to the Medicare program, so that it was mostly in the healthcare area. So, but there are a lot of things that down the road it didn't deal with that are going to need to be dealt with. For example, the healthcare benefits issue around the 2030 time frames, that fund's going to run out of money because there's no pre-funding into it. So at that point, the Postal Service is trying to estimate what it would cost to pay out of their operating revenue, which would be about $5 billion a year. I mean, they're already losing money. So they're not going to be able to deal with that. I mean, the first-class mail has been declining. It's not expected to turn around. Packages, the competition there is keen. And coming out of the pandemic, the package revenue is going down. Now, the only revenue increase is due to the tax, or the increases in the price of postage. So they have problems. They're still in debt in a number of areas. So the basic business model isn't sound going forward in the future. Congress gave it some life for a period of time, but the underlying problem is still there and needs to be dealt with. I'll ask Mr. Trimble if he has any additional comments.
No, I think that covers the main points. I think just in terms of the longer-term challenges that they face, currently their long-term liabilities and debt is over $144 billion. And they're projected to lose in fiscal 23 about $4.5 billion. And so when the health benefit fund runs out, if you're already running a deficit of $4.5 billion, you have to add another $5 billion on top of that. You can see the challenges that they're currently facing.
Well, I appreciate that. One of the things that I always say about Vermont is that we run on duct tape, twine, and hundreds of hours of volunteer time, from Vermonters across the state. And we are cheap by nature. We're thrifty. And I just want to convey that there are lots of rural communities, just like the one that I live in, Vermont, that depend on the Postal Service for their very survival. And so I certainly understand the concerns about how the business model is not working. And we made progress, I think, by my count, more than $1 billion in financial benefits came to taxpayers since 2006. because of progress in the high-risk areas, and I appreciate that as a thrifty Vermonter, but I just want to plant a flag in the ground and say we cannot let the Postal Service die on the vine. Rural America is depending on us to figure this out.
I understand that. I understand that. And, you know, my motto at GAO is elegant but cheap.
I like it.
But we also, like any Vermonters who want to come to work at GAO, it's a good place to practice their thriftiness. But also, the fundamental issue here, you know, if you look back in history, Postal Service was a government entity.
Yes.
In the beginning. And then somebody said, oh, well, we can do better than having a private sector model in this area. And it worked well until it didn't.
Right.
And so I think Congress is going to have to come to grips with what model do we want to have if we want to guarantee level of service to the American people, and who's going to pay for it.
Yeah.
And that is the decision down the road that's inevitable in this case. And what we're saying is the sooner Congress deals with that issue, the better.
Agreed. Last comment, just, you know, we did great work in a bipartisan manner on this issue in the past. I want to continue to work on this. It is really not an overstatement to say that rural America depends on the Postal Service. It's a critical infrastructure, and we got to come together. We got to continue to come together in a bipartisan manner on this issue. Thank you.
I agree.
Gentlelady's time's expired. Before I yield to Mr. Sessions, I would like to point out I spoke with Postmaster General DeJoy last night, and we hope to bring him in front of at least subcommittee hearing within the next month or so, maybe 2 months, whatever the calendar will permit. So I think that's a very good point that you all discussed, and it's something that this committee has legislative jurisdiction on. We're going to have to take very seriously. We passed the bipartisan legislation, but there's still things I think that need to be done. So I appreciate that. Chair recognizes Mr. Sessions from Texas for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. By the way, I'm probably one of a few members that sat on the old Postal Subcommittee when we saw this happening, but because we were not bipartisan, the answer did not happen. Mr. Dondero, welcome back. It's good to see you again, Gene, and thank you for your service to this nation as well as your colleagues. During both the committee hearing at which you testified in February and subsequent hearing in the Government Operations Subcommittee, which I chaired, we heard that self-certification was a leading cause of fraud in the unemployment insurance program during the COVID pandemic. Thus, it would make sense not to rely on self-certification in the future, and yet the Biden administration is proposing to allow applicants for student loan forgiveness to self-certify for this benefit. Look, I get it. The Supreme Court may decide the Biden administration does not have the authority to forgive student loans. However, it concerns me that we may be poised for another big giveaway because we're relying on self-certification. Would the gentleman please address this issue?
I, too, was concerned. So I've commissioned a GAO study to look at what the proposed operating procedures would be if they are given the green light by the Supreme Court to go through an income-driven program. And so we'll have a report out on that soon. So I share your concern on that, particularly given what happened in both the unemployment insurance and the Paycheck Protection Program and the EIDL, Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program. Plus, we've seen before on the income-driven repayment plans at the Education Department where they relied on didn't verify the incomes, that a lot of people who reported zero income really didn't have zero income. And so we made a number of recommendations there that they have better procedures to verify the income, and the department's in the process of implementing those recommendations. So you're right to be concerned. We're looking at it, and hopefully we'll have some recommendations if they go forward with that program that can provide better safeguards.
Mr. Dondero, thank you very much. In fact, the subcommittee and this committee would welcome that. As you may recall from the subcommittee hearing, it was virtually a unanimous, bipartisan viewpoint that what happened in this process of the D18 group and the things that occurred was not in the best interest of anyone except people who fraudulently received that money. So I want you to know that we will work, and I'll work with our young chairman and our young ranking member, as well as Mr. Mfume and myself, on putting together a letter that we would like to make sure that is accompanying your feedback. I think it's important that internally your team make sure that they understand that your report is coming, that we look at it the same way, that we try and authorize this in such a way to where we're all together, including the administration, not just Congress. So thank you very much. Sir, has the GAO looked at the Department of Education's self-certification, the one we were just talking about, and have they come up with any realistic viewpoint about where they might also unto themselves recognize this did not work the right way?
You mean from the Education Department officials?
Right.
Yeah.
Have they indicated, whoops, didn't quite work the way we wanted, or are they still out there following this? Look, we're going to continue this process.
Yeah, I don't know specifically the answer to that question. I will talk to the team and get a response back to you. I do know that there was some balking at cooperation with us in the first place. And, you know, because they were concerned that this might provide a roadmap for people to commit fraud. And I was saying, that's not my goal. My goal is to help you prevent fraud in the first place. So what their exact posture is right now at the working level, I don't know, but I'll get you an answer.
Thank you. I think that insight helps the six of us or the four of us up here as we attempt to provide our written guidance. I want to thank you for your service. Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Ms. Lee from Pennsylvania for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Dodaro, for joining us today in this important hearing. Waste, fraud, and abuse in our system, obviously must be taken seriously. The American people work too hard for their paychecks. They pay their fair share in taxes, or at least the 99% pays their fair share in taxes, and we should be working to ensure that tax money is used to actually benefit them. Yet Republicans on this committee will decry the need for oversight on our programs and in the same breath support Speaker McCarthy's debt ceiling legislation that's on the floor this week. Rather than help further the goals GOA lays out in the high-risk list, this bill seeks to impose drastic across-the-board cuts to critical government programs and significantly disrupt agency work that addresses the identified problems. Mr. Dodaro, in GOA's 2023 high-risk list, you outline the financial benefits that making progress on high-risk areas can yield. Since 2006, how much in financial benefits have actions on high-risk areas yielded for taxpayers?
$675 billion.
Thank you. I want to emphasize what the Comptroller General just stated. Addressing high-risk areas has provided taxpayers $675 billion in financial benefits. Mr. Dodaro, what factors do you include when you calculate financial benefits?
We include savings, cost savings, better use of the resources. We also account for revenue collections that may have come in as a result of our recommendations, and it has included revenue enhancements as well.
So the financial benefits tracked by GAO are more than just savings. They could mean reduced government expenditures, increased revenues of that limited government funds can be reallocated to higher priority areas. Is that correct?
That's correct.
What are one or two examples of recommendations from this year's high-risk list that could produce financial benefits and improve services for taxpayers if implemented correctly?
There's a number. We've had a number, for example, in the Medicare area. We think that if you equalize payments by place of service, right now, if you go to a medical appointment at a doctor who's affiliated with a hospital, as opposed to a doctor who's operating their own practice in a private building, the government will pay more for the same level of service to the doctor at the hospital physician, and we think there's tens of billions of dollars that could be saved there as well. I think, you know, there's a number of savings we had if the Congress would act to give the Energy Department more authority to look at how we dispose of nuclear waste at the Hanford site, that there's a cheaper way to do it that would save tens of billions of dollars, if not more, in disposing of that low-level activity waste at the Hanford site. This is waste that's been accumulated since World War II and the buildup of our nuclear weapon system. So those are two big examples of where there are big dollars.
Thank you. Just in closing, an ineffective government causes more than just a headache for its citizens. It can mean people have to wait longer for tax refunds that they desperately need, or that it takes longer to travel somewhere because of our crumbling roads and our bridges, something Pittsburghers know all too well. The answer is clear. We can't drop the ball when it comes to oversight of our programs. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes Ms. Mace from South Carolina for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and we're here today to talk about government accountability, oversight, transparency. We've heard about cybersecurity issues and fraudulent payments on Medicare, Medicaid, et cetera. And then our friends across the aisle want to start banging Republicans over the head over absolute nonsense and accuse us of wanting to literally take food out of babies' mouths, I think is what I heard earlier today. If I recall, it was under the current administration last year when there was a massive baby formula shortage, literally taking food out of the mouths of babies during that shortage. And if I recall during the baby formula shortage that we even had, under the Biden administration, Border Patrol agents that were literally holding baby formula imports hostage, where I had to call the Border Patrol and get baby formula released from the Border Patrol so that babies could have the formula that they needed. So to hijack this hearing over those issues is utter nonsense. We also heard others across the aisle talking about, you know, how Republicans want tax breaks for the wealthy. Well, you know, one of the greatest tax breaks for the wealthy was under the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, where there were $250 billion of tax breaks for the wealthiest 1%. That's $26,000 in SALT tax cuts for millionaires, a almost $13,000 government subsidy for couples who are making $500,000 a year to buy their luxury electric vehicles, taxpayer-funded subsidies for the wealthy for home buying, childcare, pre-K, Obamacare, paid leave, and more. So I really don't want to hear about the hypocrisy of the left on this issue at all. The IRA mentions taxes, fees, and penalties 637 times. It was the largest expansion of the federal government in 50 years. There were over 150 new government programs. And today the debate rages on about the debt ceiling, but Americans wouldn't recognize it. Americans are living paycheck to paycheck right now. They can't afford a platinum credit card with no limits, and yet that's what the federal government is doing today. The debate is not about, you know, not raising the debt ceiling. The debate is about how much to raise the debt ceiling by. The debate is not about how soon to balance the budget. The debate is not about that at all. It's not about fixing Washington's out-of-control spending, which, by the way, is bipartisan because under President Trump, he raised the debt by $8 trillion. Under President Biden, over $4 trillion. $12 trillion added to the debt over the last 6 years. And we have to deal with nonsense in this committee when we're trying to talk about ways that we can reduce waste, fraud, and abuse in the American government system. American families who run a business or run their family budgets, they understand something that the Congress does not. They cannot run on a deficit. They have to balance their checkbooks every single week. And I'm not going to give my teenage kids a platinum credit card with no limits whatsoever. And to see this debate politicized rather than having both sides come together on both sides of the aisle to say, what are we going to do to fix the debt and the spending crisis that both sides have created today? And it's absolute crickets from our friends across the aisle on the left. And so now that I have gotten totally off on the other side because the importance of this hearing is important. I do want to get to you, Mr. Dodaro, on some of this. You mentioned cybersecurity as being an issue, and I'd like to hear some of your thoughts on this issue. You know, one of the things that we brought up on this committee is the aging workforce in the federal workforce and also the workforce that isn't showing up to work, actually. But, you know, in the private sector, they don't have this issue where you have 4 times the number of federal workforce employees in IT that are over the age of 60, that'll be entering retirement soon, versus those that are under the age of 30. I mean, how big of an issue is this going to be in the next couple of years?
I think it's a very important issue and point. In fact, strategic human capital management's on the high-risk list across the federal government. I'm very concerned about the federal workforce. Less than 7% are under 30. At GAO, I might add, it's over 10. But, you know, because I've been focused on this as well. This is a real problem for the federal government. There are 22 areas of the 37 on the high-risk list because of critical skill gaps and shortages. Government-wide in the cybersecurity area, human capital management, acquisition management, and there's individual agency skill gaps in a lot of critical agencies across the government. So this is a real problem that the government has, and I'm concerned about it.
And the last thing I will add, I only have 10 seconds left. I was learning COBOL in the late 90s. I was a programmer during Y2K, and back then in the late 90s, those were legacy systems.
Yes.
And the number of systems that we have on COBOL and the advent of technology, even AI, and accessing our vulnerabilities and keeping data safe and secure is something else that we need to explore. I know your office is on top of it, so we really appreciate the reports you've been putting out and bringing cybersecurity to the forefront of this conversation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes Mr. Kassar from Texas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I think it's entirely appropriate that the Democratic minority on this committee be talking about the potential impeding crash of the American economy and the global economy if the American government, for the first time ever, doesn't pay its bills. I think if anything should be on the high-risk list, that's probably number one, would be if this Congress, led by the Republican majority, forces a default for the first time ever against the American people by this Congress not paying our bills. And so if we want to have conversation here about making sure we don't have tax breaks for the wealthiest Americans or the biggest corporations, I think that would have enormous support here from the Democratic minority. I think it'd be great for us to talk about repealing the last of the Trump tax scam, which we know benefited the top 1% of 1%. Our colleague here, Congressman Jimmy Gomez, recently introduced the 99.5% Act, which would close loopholes on the estate tax and end benefits for those billionaires that continue to avoid paying their fair share every single year. That is, of course, not in Mr. Dodaro's report because that isn't part of your gig, but since it was brought up, I think really important for us to stay here that is an extremely high risk to the American economy and to the federal government if for the first time ever folks refuse to pay, the Republican majority refuses to pay America's bills, basically holding things like SNAP benefits for ransom over it, which would take food out of children's mouths and seniors' mouths, and holding things like veterans' health care hostage. One thing, just to get back to my line of questioning here for you, Mr. Dodaro, your report rightly highlights the fact that the climate crisis is having a devastating impact on our communities. In Central Texas, 100-year floods. Now we really call every couple of year floods. We've had 3 of those in the last 10 years. So your report says that FEMA really needs to update its work in order to address things like wildfires and floods. Tell us, would FEMA be able to achieve some of your recommendations and do the work that you all are tasking it to do if its budget were cut by, say, 22%? How would that impact FEMA's ability and other agencies' ability to achieve your recommendations to deal with climate?
Yeah, it would definitely complicate their efforts by how much, I don't know. It depends on whether or not they have carryover money left or multi-year funding that's available. But FEMA workforce has been a particular problem over the years, and we've written a lot about the current gap. they'd have difficulty, staffing if we had, multiple disasters, but they have special resources they could call on. But the biggest issue, though, there on the high-risk list is flood insurance. And given what you said, I'm going to ask Ms. Orris Williams-Browns to talk about what we think needs to be done in the flood insurance area. Orris?
In the National Flood Insurance Program, this is a program that's been on the list for many years, basically following Katrina. It's a federal program, and basically the federal government stepped into the space because there was a lack of a private market, because no surprise, you're quite familiar, flooding can be unpredictable, but flooding is also the great equalizer. And the challenge with the program is balancing affordability with sustainability of the program. And FEMA's been unable to charge actuarially sound rates. They've taken some steps recently to improve the rate setting process, and that increases premiums, but it also makes sure that the premiums reflect the risk of flooding. And this is an area that FEMA can only do so much. It does also require a federal intervention in terms of addressing a number of issues related to the program.
With the goal being you don't want your flood insurance to be unaffordable, nor do you want the program to be insolvent.
Exactly.
And so, I would assume that a 22% cut to something like FEMA would make that even more challenging.
It would make administering the program challenging.
And so again, I think it is entirely appropriate for the Democrats in the hearing here today to be raising that massive cuts to programs like FEMA will make addressing flood insurance harder. It will make it harder to make sure your flood insurance isn't unaffordable, harder to make sure your the flood insurance program isn't insolvent, harder for us to deal with crop insurance as we see our crops suffer from the climate crisis, along with consistent attacks on basic programs like SNAP, which most folks know as food stamps. We want to make sure that we have teachers in our schools. We want to make sure that folks are able to put food on the table, and we want to make sure that folks are able to be more and more resilient from all of these disasters. We've gone through floods and freezes, gone through the entire electric grid in Texas shutting down, and we need to be expanding these programs, not curtailing them. Thank you, Chairman. I yield back.
Chair recognizes Mr. Biggs for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Dodaro. Your report suggests that as of December 2021, DOD expected to spend more than $1.9 trillion to acquire weapons systems. Over what time period is this spending expected?
I'm going to ask Mr. DiNapoli, our expert in that area, to respond. Tim?
Thank you for that question. It's a difficult one to answer because most of those weapon systems, that equates to a life cycle cost, so that can stretch out for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. So it is a long period of time.
So as you look at it, have you made any modification vis-a-vis the use of weapons from our stockpile in the Ukrainian crisis?
So as we mentioned before, that we do have a body of work ongoing, taking a look at not only what's been provided to the Ukrainian armed forces, but also what we're doing to replenish the stocks that we've taken them from.
So tell us what the result of your reanalysis or modification would be.
It is still ongoing, so we can't actually give you the final results, but we are looking at ways in which, how they determine which stocks would be provided from where, how we're going to, whether we replenish them with new stocks, we're just going to let them draw down, how we're going to buy those new stocks, and how we're going to, and when they're going to be available back to the armed forces.
Have you made any recommendations?
Not of yet in that particular area.
So on DOD financial management, you indicated that DOD has long-standing issues, including ineffective processes, systems and controls, incomplete corrective actions, and the need for more effective monitoring and reporting. And I think you testified to Mr. Grothman regarding their failure of an audit in 2022. And you have flagged, DOD financial management has been flagged as high risk since 1995. Your report states that financial management issues extend beyond reporting as, quote, longstanding control deficiencies adversely affect the economy, efficiency, and effectiveness of its operations, close quote. You state that 67 recommendations remain open within DOD financial management, and that implementation of previous recommendations has resulted in a savings of nearly $4 billion in taxpayer dollars. Can you provide an estimate of the cost to taxpayers for the unimplemented recommendations?
Yeah, we can look at that issue and give you an estimate. Yeah, we have done that across GAO, so I'd be happy to provide that to the committee.
Yeah, I would love to see that, because, I mean, they implemented a few of them and saved $4 billion. I'd like to know what the cost of failure to implement 60-some odd.
Yeah, we'll do.
Thank you. On business system modernization, your report states that DoD spends billions each year to acquire and modernize business systems. However, significant challenges impede DoD's efforts to improve the systems environment. And you highlight 3 critical challenges: improving business systems acquisition, improving business systems investment management, and leveraging DoD's federated business enterprise architecture. Can you provide an estimate of the cost to taxpayers for unimplemented recommendations within DoD's business system modernization efforts?
We'll have to provide that for the record.
Okay, I look forward to seeing that. You also state that weaknesses in management of contracts, finances, supply chain, support acquisition, and weapon systems acquisition adversely affect DoD's efficiency, effectiveness, and render its operations vulnerable to waste, fraud, and abuse, which in turn affects the readiness and capabilities of U.S. military forces. Can you discuss the final impact in more depth? What is the effect of waste within the Department of Defense on military readiness? And then I would ask if you're familiar with a study that was released, or where they estimated $125 billion a year was being wasted in DoD. That's not an official GAO. That is a journalist estimate. So I'm curious if you're familiar with that as well.
Yeah. We took a look at the study you're referring to. We'll provide some information for the record on that. It's been a while, but I remember what you're referring to, and we'll take a look at it and give you an answer for the record.
Yeah, I would really appreciate that, because I would guess, I don't know whether they're accurate or not with $125 billion a year, but if they are, and we've had, and that was, I think it was a 2015 study.
Yeah.
So that's 8 years, and we've had inflation since then. I would imagine that the waste, fraud, corruption, duplication, whatever you want to call it, has probably increased. I would really like to know where GAO, where you stand on that, what you're finding, and I would look forward to getting that. When might I expect that?
We should be able to provide something to you within the next month.
Okay, 30 days?
Yes, that's a month. I'll go with 30 rather than 31, but that's fine.
I was hoping for you were going to say 30 minutes, but I guess I'll take 30 days.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
The chair now recognizes Ms. Crockett from Texas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Too often when I sit in this room listening to my colleagues on the right, I ask myself, why are we having this hearing? But today is a little different, or is it? I applaud my Republican colleagues for conducting this hearing because GAO reports highlight the reasons why we cannot and should not pass the GOP's budget bill this week. You see, my colleagues on the right want their cake and they want to eat it too. I call it hypocrisy and hype. They want to use this committee as an arm of the RNC for 2024, but they don't want to provide the American people with the actual substantive solutions. They want to point out issues in the federal government, but they don't want to give the resources to fix the problems of the American people. So let's take a look at one issue that I know my constituents care about: taxes and getting their tax refunds. I'm not even going to say tax returns. They want their refunds. Like my constituents in Texas 30 last week, I had to file my tax returns with the IRS, and like them, I want to make sure that I get my money, which ain't really anyway. But according to the GAO report that is the focus of today's hearing, the IRS, quote, needs to increase its capacity to implement new initiatives, improve ongoing enforcement and taxpayer service programs, and combat identity theft and refund fraud, unquote. I have no doubt federal employees at the IRS work hard to ensure Americans' tax refunds go into the right hands. How do I know this? Because my mom is one of those federal employees that works for the IRS. And honestly, she's the hardest working woman that I know. But even with this GAO high-risk report that one of my colleagues wanted to have a hearing on today cites that the primary reason for declines in audit rates and roughly $50 million to $250 million in payments by the government to fraudulent tax returns is because of reduced staffing due to decreased funding, because last time I checked, ain't nobody trying to work for free. So how would my Republican colleagues plan to fix this? Well, just this past January, they voted to defund the IRS even more, slashing $80 billion under the Inflation Reduction Act passed by Democrats last Congress. And now Republicans are using the GOP budget bill to cut this $80 billion to the IRS. On top of how ridiculous this solution is, I'm not even surprised that the CBO projected that in cutting this funding, the Republican budget bill would add $114 billion to the national deficit. Simply put, if Republicans really cared about fiscal responsibility and protecting American taxpayer dollars, they would put their money where their mouth is. But as we know, their budget bill represents their priorities, and it's clear that their priorities are to protect wealthy tax cheats instead of throwing the federal hammer down on them. At the end of the day, I am here to do a job, and that's to protect my constituents. So I'd like to close out by asking our witnesses the following questions. Mr. Dodaro, what steps must Congress take to combat identity theft and fraud through the IRS and improve agency efficiencies so that people can get their refunds?
We have a number of recommendations for that Congress in that area. You know, one would be to require additional electronic filing. You know, rather than have the paper returns, keyed in, that's an inefficient process and induces errors into the process. I'll ask Mr. McTighe to elaborate a little bit further. But one additional thing is to give IRS the authority to set requirements for paid tax preparers. Many of the unenrolled paid tax preparers actually have greater error rates than people preparing their own taxes. So I think it would be provided better oversight over that area, and to also require more third-party information reporting so IRS could match against the records. That would provide more accurate and timely responses. Jay, would you have any additions?
Those are the key ones. I guess the one additional comment I would make, Congress could provide IRS with greater authority to correct simple math errors where taxpayers have inadvertently made errors. Information differs from what IRS or the government has in its databases, and that would not only help in terms of IRS's administration, but it also would reduce the burden on taxpayers to address those errors through correspondence and back and forth with the IRS. Obviously, taxpayers need to have protections and the ability to interact with IRS too.
I understand. Thank you so much, and you would agree that IRS needs resources to be able to carry out these plans, correct?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
I was just saying you would agree with me that the IRS does need resources in order to effectuate these plans, correct?
GAO has long pointed out that IRS does receive considerable resources, and it's imperative that they use the resources that they have most efficiently and effectively. But that can only go so far, particularly with the growth in the economy and the growth in the number of taxpayers.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Dodaro, great to see you. Thank you for coming before us to discuss a matter of the utmost importance. I commend you and your staff on the work that was put into this year's high-risk report. Many of the wasteful government programs that you identified here today have been discussed and rightfully criticized. Discussions are good and can be effective. However, discussions require follow-through to be effective. Unfortunately, Congress and the executive branch have been missing the bar when it comes to follow-through for decades. As you know, my colleague, Rep. Kilmer, and I worked on legislation contained in last year's NDAA that requires GAO to provide succinct priority recommendation reports to congressional committees. These reports would be organized by topic and contain the amount of time a priority recommendation has been open for and a cost savings estimate, among other things. So my first question is, how many total priority recommendations produced by the GAO remain outstanding? What recommendations has been outstanding the longest, and how long is that?
There's hundreds of open priority recommendations. I'd have to go back and look at the winner, if you will, who's been open the longest. There's a number to go back a number of years. It's years. It's years.
10 years or less?
Well, I don't know, and I'm not going to guess. Sure. We don't guess at GAO. We'll give you the facts.
I'll give you another one. What recommendation that hasn't been addressed concerns you the most?
There's a number that could save a lot of money. The one I mentioned earlier in the Medicare area, where you were paying people differently based on place of service for the same service. That doesn't seem to be a good practice on the part of the federal government. Secondly, would be the one I just mentioned on IRS, which is to give IRS to set requirements for paid tax preparers. I think that would generate additional revenue for the federal government without any additional costs, and it'd be a more fair and equitable tax system. The one on Hanford is important too, because that has, in low-level radioactive waste disposal, that has tens of billions of dollars in potential benefits.
I know you don't like guessing, but what if we implemented all of the recommendations you've made? How much do you think that would save the federal government?
Between 30 billion and 100 billion.
So we should implement these recommendations.
I don't have to guess on that. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
How much of this falls on congressional inaction compared to the executive branch agencies?
It falls, about equally. There's a number of open recommendations for the Congress as well as the agencies. Most of the big dollar savings, though, would have to require congressional action.
So in regards to the initial report from the legislation that was signed into law last year in the NDAA, how far along is it, and when do you think Congress should expect to receive it?
You'll have it in June.
In June?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you. I want to transition to PPP fraud. Obviously, tens of billions, possibly $100 billion was stolen through the PPP loan program. And I actually introduced the PPP Shell Company Discovery Act, which basically forces communication between SBA, IRS, and DOJ. And I think that's just one step in reclaiming fraudulent payments. I guess my question is the SBA fit to mitigate fraud in future emergency situations? Did we learn anything?
Yes, so we learned quite a bit. SBA is trying to put in place a better fraud management framework that meets GAO best practices. We've had several conversations with the current administrator. They've finally designated an entity, but it's not fully staffed yet. They still have to do some more work. But yes, I think we've learned some things. We're trying to put in place better practices over there. And I'm encouraged, but we're not where we need to be yet, fully.
In retrospect, do you think that we should have given, the CARES Act should have given SBA access to some documents from a limited nature from the IRS to prevent what was hundreds of billions of dollars of fraud? Would that have fixed it?
That would have made a big start on it. For example, they were prohibited by Congress from using tax transcripts in the emergency or the economic injury disaster loan program, where they used them for the normal program, and that put them at a big disadvantage. Even though Congress corrected that later, it still took them months to be able to get that back as control.
Sure, thank you. I yield, and with that, the chair now recognizes Mr. Frost, Florida, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My colleagues called this hearing to look at GAO's high-risk list, a place where no government agency should be, and I commend the Biden administration for making historic improvements over the past 2 years to get agencies off of this list and welcome the opportunity to help address some others. I also understand the concern of my Republican colleagues. 3 new areas were added to the high-risk list, and one in particular, the federal prison system. And, I'm kind of glad in this new interest I'm seeing from Republicans on this committee that are showing interest in how incarcerated people are being treated, even if it seems that that started just about 2 years ago on January 6th. Some of us fight against mass incarceration, unjust prison conditions, and a lack of reentry resources on behalf of our loved ones, friends, and constituents behind bars. It seems like Republicans are looking to do it only for insurrectionists. But regardless of how you got here, welcome to the fight. Mr. Dodaro, I'm curious, in the high-risk list, the GAO notes that the Bureau of Prisons hasn't evaluated programs for incarcerated folks in decades. According to the GAO, the Bureau of Prisons has a long-standing challenges, including several leadership changes, unsound stewardship of financial resources, and poor planning and evaluation of programs to help incarcerated people successfully return to society and their community. What changed in your assessment of their failures that elevated the Bureau of Prisons to high risk?
Well, one was the fact that this has been occurring over a period of time. I was very concerned about that. We also looked at the implementation of the First Step Act and waited actually until their original implementation of that act. You mentioned leadership changes. They've had 6 directors in 6 different years. The staffing problems, the extensive use of overtime led to safety concerns both for the inmates and the staff. And I'll ask Charles Johnson, our expert, to elaborate a little bit more.
Yes, thank you, Comptroller General. And Congressman, as the Comptroller General mentioned, there have been longstanding staffing challenges. One of the recommendations we made was that the BOP needed to collect better data, and be able to monitor and come up with a real need at which they are able to calculate their staffing needs. Currently, we're finding that they've been authorized about 40,000 personnel, and they're roughly at about 35,000. So they have a 15% gap in their staffing levels, which does impact the safety and security not only of the individuals incarcerated, but their personnel as well. There's a massive use of overtime. Overtime has increased about 100%, and we felt like they needed to also assess their use of overtime and the impact that overtime has on their operations as well, among a lot of factors as well.
Thank you. And I understand that before assigning a high-risk designation, GAO assesses the effectiveness of an agency's planned or ongoing corrective actions. Mr. Dodaro, since the Bureau of Prisons was elevated to the high-risk list, has there been any signals of positive change or compliance with legal requirements?
I was very encouraged. I met with the new director of the Bureau of Prisons. We talked about this. I was impressed with her commitment to addressing these issues. They're working on some detailed plans to address this area. We're going to work with them and agree on a set of specific metrics that we're going to follow to determine when we take them off the high-risk list, because it not only takes leadership commitment, it takes capacity, an action plan, and actual monitoring and demonstrating some results. So I think we're going to lay a good framework in place. Once we have those metrics, I will share them with the Congress, of course.
Thank you. In Florida, we have the 3rd largest prison and incarcerated population in the nation. The Republican legislature in Florida is intent on creating new criminal penalties for reading the wrong books, treating the wrong patients, what they call the wrong patients, and who knows what other infringements on our freedom will come from the state of Florida. Floridians have a large stake in rehabilitation programs simply because we have such a large incarcerated population. What are some actionable steps that the Bureau of Prisons can implement that can contribute to them getting off of the next high-risk list?
They can develop a better staffing model. They can make sure that they have a program evaluation plan for evaluating these programs to help prevent recidivism. Their latest estimate shows that about 45% of the population within 3 years after release ends back in prison. And so there's a lot of those areas that they can do, as well as specifying a little bit more about what would qualify for some of the benefits for early release right now that's allowed under the First Step Act.
Thank you. The effective planning and ongoing evaluation of these programs is essential to lower risk of recidivism and ensure formerly incarcerated folks can be integrated back into our communities. Thank you. I yield back.
The chair recognizes Mr. Fallon from Texas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Dodaro, what do you think the estimated total fraud is for the PPP program?
On the PPP program, we don't have a fraud estimate, but there was $36 billion estimated for improper payments. We're looking at, making that. The only one we have a fraud estimate now for is, at the low end, was unemployment insurance, which we estimated was over $60 billion.
And what can we do in the future to prevent the PPP, fraud or mispayments, and also on the unemployment?
First is not allow just total self-certification. That invites fraud. Secondly, was to make sure the agencies implement GAO's framework for preventing fraud in the first place. Secondly, is to require internal control plans that have special procedures for emergency loan programs. We're about ready to issue a report on a framework for that going forward, but I think it would be good if Congress required that framework in law. And also, any new program over $100 million, in my opinion, should be automatically deemed susceptible to improper payments so that there's an estimate made earlier in the process. Under the current rules, it could be 2 or 3 years before they make an estimate of improper payments. And this is what happened with PPP. I mean, the first time they did it is 2022. You know, they should have begin doing it a lot earlier, but we recommended they do, but they weren't able to do it or didn't do it.
We don't hear a lot in this building, common sense, in good sense, so thank you for that. The Department of Defense spends billions of dollars each year to acquire and modernize business systems, including ones that address key, areas such as like personnel, financial management, healthcare, and logistics, et cetera. And in my opinion, every time it seems like the good idea fairy visits the Pentagon, a new colonel gets his wings. I mean, it's massively bureaucratic over there, and I sit on the HASC committee. There's so much duplicative effort over there, and it comes as no surprise to me that we struggle to bridge the kind of the valley of death in a system designed like that. Through your work at the GAO, how do you think the DoD can best streamline business functions at the Pentagon?
Implement leading practices. We do a lot of studies, and I'll ask Tim Manelli, or excuse me, DiNapoli, to come to the table to explain about how we've used leading practices to improve their weapon systems portfolio.
So through the years, as I've mentioned before, DoD has been unable to deliver weapon systems on a timely basis, and cost increases. So what we did for the last 20 years, have gone out to the private sector to look at a variety of companies and see how they develop and produce their systems. By looking at, and the companies that we identify cut across industries, so it's not one particular segment. We try to look for the best companies in particular areas. And what we've been able to do is to distill those practices that are common to leading companies. We've made a series of recommendations through the years for the department to incorporate those. And for the most part, at least in the early years, the department has been able to do that in their policies. They don't follow them on a consistent basis, which means that from a practice perspective, they're not following what the policies are. We're currently updating that work to identify new practices based on new technologies and new information. And we've identified 3 or 4 key things that the department could do in terms of trying to develop weapon systems and field them more quickly. The department has not yet implemented those in their policies. We find mixed in terms of whether or not individual programs are implementing them in their practices. So I think there's a ways to go yet in terms of how weapon systems can be acquired. But that same principle can apply to almost any business modernization system as well.
Well, yeah, and that's the thing. I think it's obvious that the DoD can learn a lot from the private sector. Do you think that they're looking enough to the private sector for that help and for really just to follow that example? You don't always have to reinvent the wheel.
It's always a challenge, right? Because folks within the department have a legacy system, and they're trying to maintain those.
Yeah.
And so trying to develop new systems requires both the maintaining of the existing, make sure that we have those capabilities, and then figuring out a way to implement those new processes in an efficient, effective way. There's sometimes challenges on both sides.
An efficient and effective way. That's what we're after.
Yeah, one of the things that I think is important is that we've been trying to impress upon the department the importance of maturing technology before you put it into production. Oftentimes they rush ahead. Now I know that there's pressures to meet peer competition, near peer competition, and other things that force them to do that, but that leads to costly reinvestments down the road where they have to correct things. I mean, the Joint Strike Fighter is a good example of that, and we're looking at the Columbia-class submarine development. That's got some scheduling issues and others. So, but that's an important part as you sit on your assignments on the defense committees to check on is the maturity of the technology before they hit the production button.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
The chair recognizes Mrs. Bush from the great state of Missouri.
Yes,
for 5 minutes.
great state of Missouri. All right, St. Louis and I are here today for a timely and important hearing. Mr. Dodaro, it's a pleasure to see you again, and hello to all the GAO staff. Last Congress, we discussed the federal government's obligation to clean up areas where federal activities, including nuclear weapons production, have contaminated the environment. The Department of Energy knew that Coldwater Creek in North St. Louis County was dangerously contaminated in the 1960s, yet it has taken over 60 years to address this crisis. The federal government now faces $626 billion in liabilities for these cleanup responsibilities. For decades, radioactive materials from the first atomic bomb were allowed to seep deadly contamination into Coldwater Creek in my district. Toxic chemicals like radium and uranium continue to threaten the safety and well-being of my constituents and my loved ones in St. Louis. As a result, tens of thousands of people in my community have confirmed or suspected exposure to radioactive waste. That means lung cancer, bone cancer, leukemia, breast cancer, skin cancer, and that's just to name a few of the tragic impacts. Far beyond the monetary cost, I know the human toll that this high-risk area takes because I've lived it and my constituents continue to live it every single day. We're not talking about a distant problem. I am in this room. I lived by the creek for a number of years. Even when I moved a few minutes away, the fully finished basement of my new townhouse would flood with potentially radioactive water. My son's room was in that basement. Our children are not safe living near the graveyard of an atomic bomb factory. Mr. Dodaro, what progress has been made on the Coldwater Creek issues, which remains on the high-risk list since 2021?
Ask Mr. Gaffigan, our expert, to respond, please.
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. And we discussed this 2 years ago.
We did.
We did. And at your request, we've been looking at this issue. Coldwater Creek is one of 20 FUSRAP sites, which were the commercial side of the Manhattan Project that have left a legacy of waste, not only in your state, but 7 other states. So we are currently undergoing a review of the Corps. The Army Corps is charged with the cleanup of these 20 sites, and we're looking at Coldwater Creek and all the sites and all these communities and assessing where they are and assessing the environmental liabilities, where the risks are. Are they following leading practices for doing the cleanup? And what is the engagement with the community, the communication and sharing with the folks of what's going on? So we're looking at all those issues, and we visited Coldwater Creek in November of 2022, talked to the residents there and the cleanup officials, and we expect to report to you in August of 23 on the status of that project as well as the others.
Thank you. Thank you for all of that info. All right. And we know, as we know, some progress has been made. Much more still needs to be done just across the board. Last October, high levels of radioactive exposure were detected in samples taken from the library, from the kitchen, classrooms, fields, and playground of Jana Elementary School in my district. The school has since been permanently shut down. Mr. Dodaro, or what more can the federal government do to tackle this serious issue? Or it can go to, yeah.
Yeah, sure. And that's one of the things we're looking at. I know there's been several studies done just to that elementary school and what's going on. And I think that'll be encompassed in our report as well because of contamination from that site.
Okay, thank you. Yesterday, I introduced the bipartisan, bicameral Justice for Jana Elementary Act to ensure that potentially radiation-exposed schools in my district are lifted up and not left behind. It will require the federal government to clean up Jana Elementary and test other properties in the school district for contamination. You know, when we think about this issue, while Republicans are working to cut funding that will undermine the federal government's ability to meet its obligations to clean contaminated areas and assist suffering communities like ours, Democrats, we are working to make sure the federal government does more and invests more robust funding to support our communities. Congress and the federal government must meet their hazardous waste cleanup obligations to our communities. Yet Republicans and their Default on America Act would deprive the government of resources to tackle these hazards and put the health and education of yet another generation of children at risk. I want to thank Mr. Dodaro and the GAO for being here today and answering our questions. I yield back.
Thank you.
The chair recognizes myself for 5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Dodaro. There have been several programs that have been mentioned today and in your testimony that have been included in the high-risk list since the 90s. Can you, so the ones I recall is Medicare, the fact there's improper payments, cybersecurity, which is a high risk, strategic human capital management, any others?
The ones from the 1990, the original charter list, if you will, was the DoD weapon systems, the tax administration, Department of Energy contracting system, NASA's acquisition system, and Medicare.
Okay, and so have any of these agencies fallen off the list? Which ones?
These are the ones that are currently on the list.
That have been there since the 90s?
Yeah, there was 14 on the original 1990. I'm talking about just the original 1990 list. There were 14. 6 are left. So eight have come off the list over time. And we've had, and in total, have been about 27 areas we've designated over time that have come off the list. There's a complete list in the report on when they came off the list.
So is there any factors that are in common with the 6 that are remaining on the list? Any structural issues with those?
Yeah, there's some inherent risk, associated with those issues. Weapon systems are one-of-a-kind kind of things that are developed. Medicare is a large and growing program with, thousands of, if not millions of transactions every year. With those programs, but they're all unique. There really is not one single thing but I would also, point out that in those 6 areas, even though they're still on the list, there's been a lot of progress made and some of the financial benefits. We mentioned the $675 billion that's been saved since 2006. Some of them, a significant part of them have come from those 6 programs.
Oh, that's promising to hear because, seeing that they've been on this since the 90s is discouraging. But do you have any issues with agencies ignoring the fact that they're on the list? Is there any punishment or anything that happens when an agency is identified and placed on the high risk?
Yeah, the only statutory requirement is that if GAO puts something on the high-risk list, that the OMB needs to do a portfolio review of that issue. And so we've been having regular meetings with OMB, the agencies on the high-risk list, and GAO. I personally participate in those meetings. But other than that, there's no, quote, penalty. Nobody ignores us. We won't let them. And so, we're working with them, and I'd like to see, the continued leadership commitment. One of the things we take very seriously is, since these are longstanding problems, is to provide transition between administrations of having each successive administration commit to that issue, and I've had good success there.
But if you could implement one measure that would save the United States an enormous amount of money and eliminate a lot of opportunity for fraud, of all the things, what would you say?
Equalizing the payment process by place of payment for Medicare. I mentioned this early. If you go into a doctor's office at a hospital or you go into a doctor's office in a private building, the government pays you more for the same treatment in a hospital than there. That tens of billions of dollars there, and it will reduce the amount of potential fraud in Medicare. And there's,
I know of patients, family members that are on Medicare, and were getting treatment in an outpatient setting, and they were moved. The hospital made a decision to end that service so they could move them into the hospital so they could charge more. And it happens all the time.
Yeah, well, and it's costly. It's costly. And you don't get any better treatment. I mean, you get the same treatment.
Same
So
service.
I've been trying to get Congress to act on this for many years. I have several of my gray hair have come from this particular recommendation. And there are many others that we have.
Thank you. My time has expired.
Sure.
The chair now recognizes Mr. Goldman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Dodaro, I'm going to focus a little bit on security clearances today. The government-wide personnel security clearance process was added to the high-risk list 5 years ago. Is that right?
That's correct.
All right. I see you have a colleague join you. Happy for her to answer any of these questions. That year, the federal government announced the Trusted Workforce 2.0, which was an ambitious personnel vetting reform plan that intended to streamline and expedite the 3 personnel vetting processes under a single policy framework, focusing on suitability as well as fitness, and a couple of other issues that I'll get to. In the most recent high-risk report, the GAO says that considerable progress has been made in implementing this reform, but there is no rating for this area since the last report. It also identifies several problems, including examples of partially met initiatives relating to capacity, which is a schedule to manage oversight of security clearances, an action plan, monitoring, and demonstrated progress that the changes have not fully been implemented since the GAO recommended them 5 years ago. And this is a particular importance in recent months, as you no doubt know. Between January and April of this year, dozens of classified U.S. intelligence documents surfaced on public websites, and it was determined that a leaker who was a 21-year-old IT employee of the National Guard, of the Air National Guard, who had the highest level of security clearance, was ultimately charged criminally with unauthorized retention and transmission of national defense information and removal of classified documents. Now, this individual, Jack Teixeira, regularly posted racist and anti-government content online, on the gaming app Discord, on a group called Thug Shaker Central, and he was openly anti-federal government and criticized U.S. support for Ukraine. Now, this episode reveals severe blind spots in our security clearance process, especially as it relates to white nationalism and anti-government ideology. And Mr. Dodaro, what actions has the GAO taken or plans to take to address this gap in vetting white nationalist and anti-government sentiments in the security clearance process?
I'm going to ask Ms. Barrick, who's our expert in the area, to respond.
Yeah, thank you for the question. There's a number of areas that we're reviewing with respect both to the security clearance process and also the insider threat program that exists within the department. Related to the security clearance process itself, we're looking at continuous vetting for individuals that have received a clearance. Right now, the executive branch does not have a way to assess performance of how that's working. We're also looking at the capacity of the department to develop a new management information system to track clearances and be able to grant reciprocity. We're also looking at controls related to protecting national security systems. With respect to the insider threat program, we've looked at DoD's programs and have found that in some cases they were not meeting minimum federal standards. to protect national security systems. So we made a number of recommendations for them to strengthen that.
Good.
Given the recent incident, we're going to be doing a follow-on review looking at their insider threat program.
All right. I'm happy to hear that. I think all or nearly all of my colleagues would emphasize and agree that this is a serious national security issue. But I am concerned that at least one colleague of mine does not seem to recognize that this is a concern. Here is a tweet from a member of this committee which says that Jack Teixeira is white, male, Christian, and anti-war. That makes him an enemy to the Biden regime. He told the truth about troops being on the ground. Ask yourself who is the real enemy, a young low-level National Guardsman or the administration that is waging war in Ukraine. Mr. Dodaro, without putting you on the spot, who is the real enemy to our national security, President Biden or Jack Teixeira, who disclosed top secret and unauthorized information?
Anyone who violates their oath to protect the Constitution would fall into that category.
Thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The chair now recognizes Ms. McLean.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. The past 2 years, HHS, under the Biden administration, I think has fallen short in many areas. The GAO has concluded that HHS has failed to establish clear roles and responsibilities, provide clear and consistent communication, especially around COVID-19. As it pertains to transparency, accountability, really to ensure the public's trust to ensure public trust, and has really failed to understand key partners' capabilities and their limitations. Specifically, as the chair of the subcommittee in oversight on healthcare and financial services, I'd found that the FDA to be gravely flawed in responding to the baby formula crisis. We had a whole hearing on that. And we can say that, it's Abbott's issue and it's the FDA's issue, but last I checked, we have all of these government agencies, and it's their job to oversee to make sure instances like this doesn't happen. So my question is, has the GAO identified other areas where the FDA has been deficient, right? We can't fix a problem until we can first admit we may have one.
Yes, I mean, there are 2 areas on the high-risk list that involve FDA, 3, including the new one that we just added. But one is oversight of medical products and safety, including pharmaceuticals, also a range of drugs, as well as medical devices. And we made a lot of recommendations there. The other is food safety. We've had food safety on the high-risk list for a number of years, and FDA is one of the key players there as well.
So I'm curious, because in my hearing, I asked a couple questions, but I'm curious to know if you know how many of those regulators are actually back to work and not teleworking.
Offhand, I don't know. I don't know if any of my colleagues know. Apparently not. But we're looking at the use of telework across the federal government. So I'll check with that team. They're not here today, and see if we have an answer there. We can.
I mean, I would think as a regulator, it's kind of difficult to regulate a facility sitting on your couch. But, I think some jobs, as much as we'd like to stay at home, we actually have to begin to hold the government to the same standards that we hold private industry to. And that is outcomes and outcome-based. What changes have been made around food security and food safety?
Not enough in our view. I mean, we've been calling for a government-wide food security safety plan for a number of years with clear performance measures and guidelines. That hasn't been forthcoming.
Well, what? So I just want to make sure I understand.
Right.
So we have a government agency that is their job to oversee food safety, right? They hold, right? They hold.
Well, there's 15 federal agencies and 30 different laws that require them to have food safety. You have USDA involved, you have CDC,
Sure.
you have
so 15 agencies.
Right.
Yeah. Thank you for that clarification. So we have 15 agencies upon agency upon agency to do a job. From what I heard you say, we've given them recommendations or we've asked for some sort of accountability, some sort of measurements, and they just haven't had the opportunity to do it. I wonder what they're doing.
Well, they're
Clearly not their job.
Well, they're doing a lot
that
of
they're
things,
paid to do.
They're doing a lot of things, and I'll ask Mr. Gaffigan to respond on food safety. But the issue is...
But hang on
the
one
issue
second.
is-
Let me, and I don't mean to interrupt you, but we've asked them for outcomes on the job that they were signed up and paid to do, and we have not received that from them?
There's no government-wide plan yet. We've asked Congress to require the government-wide plan, to recreate an interagency working group to work together. We've even recommended in the past there be a single food safety program, and that Congress, move in that direction. So the agencies haven't done it, and Congress hasn't required them to do it. Mark, you want to add anything there?
Yeah, it's been frustrating since 2007, all those options we've laid out, both for the executive branch and for Congress. And to come back to your example of infant formula, in the response, they said, well, let's develop immediate national strategy.
Let's hire more people to do a study.
Let's develop an immediate national strategy. That's not the way to do a national strategy, right? An immediate national strategy. So they're planning to try to formalize that. But for each thing that comes up, these agencies, working with all the regulations, try to address them piecemeal. And we think a national strategy would be a much more effective way to do that.
Yeah, like for example, on the infant food safety infant formula, if I might, I think
Briefly.
this is a very important point. On that area, that market for infant formula is a very fragile, concentrated market that's insulated from domestic and foreign production. And also, a big factor is the WIC program, and there's a single-payer approach on the WIC program. So even though you have FDA there, the actions taken by HHS and how we hire companies to provide services through the states on the WIC program has a big impact on the infant formula market. So you need a whole government approach to deal with these issues.
We'll talk
appreciate
more.
the indulgence of the chair. I'm sorry.
The chair now recognizes Ms. Porter from California.
Thank you very much. And they say bipartisanship is dead. And yet, I am the ranking member of the Oversight Subcommittee on Healthcare and Financial Services, and Representative McClain is the chairwoman of that committee, and I want to echo a lot of what she just asked you about. She is absolutely right that we need to be outcome-based, that we had a terrific hearing on this, and yet did not get, I don't think, a fully satisfactory plan. I think what you've added to us very helpfully, Mr. Dodaro, is a sense that it's not just the FDA, that we have bad interagency, or I should, sometimes bad interagency communication, certainly a much better opportunity for interagency cooperation. So I'm interested in the whole of government approach. I think would be happy to talk with my colleague on the other side of the aisle about whether or not that's something we should have a hearing about, because I think what we took away, both of us, Republican and Democrat, from the FDA hearing is that what we saw with the infant formula crisis could very well occur again, because we have not fully adapted and changed. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. That's why they're on the high-risk list. I'm very concerned about, FDA's got challenges on both of their fronts, on the food safety front and on the medical product safety, particularly since a lot of that is domestic or foreign production now in those areas. So both of their responsibilities have grown, and I think it's a need to take a re-examination of their capabilities. We've raised the need for a workforce plan for FDA and others, and I'm really concerned about this because part of this is, and I've spent most of my career trying to get the government to adapt to changing circumstances in their environment, and this has outstripped the capacity, I believe, of FDA to deal with these issues on a satisfactory basis.
Yeah, amen. And I will just say that I think a big focus of my time in Congress has been trying to get the government to adapt to changes in circumstances. So I take it that you think that the FDA's announcement to create a human foods program is only a partial solution here to the larger problem of interagency coordination that's needed.
Absolutely.
So I mean, I think that while that plan would reduce fragmentation and improve coordination, it simply isn't going to get us to the whole of government, which is where we need to be.
Yeah, absolutely. It doesn't get to the root cause of the problems.
Now, as you know, doing the work and being outcome-based, as Representative McClain says, takes resources. The President's fiscal year 2024 budget requests an increase of $521 million for the FDA, about 10% more than last year. I want to make sure those tax dollars are used wisely and effectively in programs that work, but it's hard to square with the FDA improving when, in fact, House Republican leadership is asking us to vote for a bill that would slash the FDA's budget by 22% or more. You just said that they have more work to do. Is giving them less resources going to help them?
It definitely is going to be a complicating factor to ensure that you have those issues well. We haven't specifically looked at squarely the issue that you're talking about, but it is an issue that has to be carefully considered because it could have serious consequences.
Yeah, I want to turn to talk about the federal role in housing. Homeownership is incredibly important to American families, to their way of life, to their security, to their well-being, to their ability to have economic stability, and it's out of reach for too many, homeownership. Since 2013, so for a decade, GAO has designated the federal role in housing finance as a high-risk area. And in 2019, Treasury and HUD did work to lessen some of the risk by issuing housing finance reform plans. They had 81 administrative recommendations to the agencies. How many of these 81 administrative recommendations have been implemented?
Yeah, I'm not sure offhand, but I'll ask Doris Williams-Brown, our expert, to help respond.
Yes, thank you. I actually don't have the list. We're happy to do some digging and provide a response.
I mean, I'm concerned that I hope you do the digging, because we actually tried to identify some of this information, and we were having trouble keeping track of whether or not Treasury and HUD, they seem to have stopped systematically tracking their implementation. And we can't tell if these are finished recommendations or unfinished recommendations, and we can't assess the risk that we still face in housing finance if they don't do that. So I would like you to both track them and put it on your website so we can see who's making progress on these 81 recommendations and who is not. I also want to just point out briefly, Mr. Chair, if I could, that you also made 35 recommendations to Congress on reducing risk in housing finance, and Congress has enacted 0. And so this is, again, like with the FDA, a problem both of agencies and Congress having opportunities. And we can't just keep passing the buck back and forth between each other. We have to act in concert to deliver. So thank you very much for your indulgence, Mr. Chair.
Chair now recognizes Ms. Boebert from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to Comptroller Dodaro for joining us today. It is this committee's responsibility to investigate the root and root out causes of waste, fraud, and abuse and mismanagement. Noticeably, this year's report indicated that the Department of Health and Human Services leadership and coordination of public health emergencies, even though COVID is over, and the unemployment insurance system, it was added to the high-risk list after the Biden administration has continued to fumble the ball when it comes to responsibly managing taxpayer dollars regarding COVID management. Comptroller Dodaro, for some background information, what are some of the ways that certain agencies and programs are added to the high-risk list?
Yeah, we consider a number of factors. One, we do ongoing work at GAO all the time across all areas of the federal government. So we look at our institutional knowledge of these issues. We consult each inspector general lists what they believe the top management issues are in each of their individual agencies across government. So we consult that. We consider the amount of money that's involved. There has to be at least $1 billion. And we look at a lot of qualitative factors as well, the impact on public safety, for example, and other matters.
Thank you. The high-risk list this year included one very notable addition, the Department of Health and Human Services Leadership and Coordination of Public Health Emergencies. Can you elaborate on their failures of this program?
Yes, yes. I'll ask Jess Farb, who's our expert in the healthcare area.
Thank you for the question.
Yes, ma'am.
So we looked at HHS's response to public health emergencies over decades. So not just the most recent emergency that we're all familiar with, but response to Zika, response to natural disasters, responses to Ebola. And so looking at that, we found that HHS did not have a number of things in place that would have helped with this response, including understanding roles and responsibilities, the capacity of their partners, communicating clearly with the public, being transparent about actions that need to be taken. So there were a number of things that we observed over time across multiple public health emergencies that allowed us to sort of come to the conclusion that they needed to be added to the list.
Yeah, and I want to keep it visible to the American public and to the Congress, because I don't think we're anywhere near as prepared for the next emergency as we need to be.
So have these leadership failures at HHS contributed to other, it sounds like it does, other health emergencies like the baby formula shortage, the crisis at the border, and the several other natural disasters that took place just last year?
HHS is a very complex department, as we all know, and having multiple components that both need to act independently but also work together. And we were talking about this earlier, how agencies need to coordinate not only across the government, but also even within the department. And this is a case with HHS that they need to do more coordination within the department to respond.
The report found that the GAO has consistently found deficiencies in HHS's ability to lead the country's preparedness, as mentioned, and response for more than 10 years, which is quite literally their job to do. According to a report published in January of last year, you identified 246 total recommendations for improving federal operations at HHS alone. How many of your recommendations has the Biden administration implemented?
I believe we'll have to get back to you with an answer on that for the record. I don't know off the top of my head how many they've implemented, but they have implemented some recommendations. How many of that total number, I can't give you the number today.
Yeah, and I would say, you know, HHS is one of the agencies that has a relatively lower percentage of implementing our recommendations than is a norm across federal government. So we're trying to work to increase that, and whatever help we can get from the Congress, we'd appreciate.
Thank you. I look forward to assisting in that and hearing that we have bipartisan support and getting Congress to act to assist you in that. I think we should put that as one of our priorities here. Another notable addition to this list is the unemployment insurance system. In your report, you indicated this addition is largely due to large amounts of fraud and improper payments, which have come at a huge cost to taxpayers, of course. Did the rate of these errors in unemployment insurance systems increase throughout the 53-week extension from this administration?
It's been going on since during the entire pandemic, yes. Tom, would you like to add?
Yeah, the improper payment rate went up. It's now at 22%, but that doesn't include the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program, where we expect that the improper payment rate is higher than that.
Thank you. My time has expired, and I yield. Thank you for your answers.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Ms. Brown from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Dodaro, for joining us today. I appreciate us holding this important hearing to review the Government Accountability Office biannual high-risk list. The high-risk list is an important tool for the government to responsibly manage trillions of dollars of spending. And if we're honest, when the Biden administration came into office, there were certainly opportunities for improved oversight of past federal spending. With the Trump administration's $2 trillion tax giveaway to the wealthy and giant corporations, Republicans' actions had a detrimental impact on the federal deficit. In fact, President Biden inherited a historically high deficit. As always, Democrats came in and started righting the ship. For example, take the investment in our tax enforcement made possible by the Inflation Reduction Act. That provision alone means billions of dollars back in the pockets of American people by having the wealthy begin to pay their fair share. Unfortunately, my friends on the other side of the aisle are proposing legislation to directly undo all of that good work. Their Default on America Act is part of the backwards catastrophic Republican plan. According to Moody's Analytics, the Republican budget would, quote, meaningfully increase the likelihood of a recession and result in 780,000 fewer jobs by the end of 2024, end quote. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle are willing to put our country on the brink of recession to make sure that the top 1% can get away with contributing half or a third of what a school teacher or firefighter pays in taxes. Does that make sense to anyone here? The Republicans' proposal slashes non-defense discretionary funding by 22%. That would mean cuts of more than 20% from everything like veterans' medical care to rail safety inspections and more. The Default on America Act would also threaten the strength of our federal workforce and ability of federal agencies to fill those workforce vacancies. So, Mr. Dodaro, how would the inability to fill critical workforce positions at federal agencies contribute to an increase in high-risk programs?
Well, 22 of the 37 areas on the high-risk list, 22 of the 37 are on there in part because they already have critical skill gaps and shortages. So the extent to which those continue or are exacerbated would prevent them from solving fully and gaining the capacity that they need to be able to address those issues.
Thank you for that. Now, for the record, how much in savings is returned to the economy for every dollar spent at the GAO?
In the last 5 years, it's averaged $145.
Thank you. Frankly, I find it alarming that workforce and skills gaps, which would be significantly worsened by the default on our debt plan, could have such a harmful impact on the high-risk programs that the Biden administration is working diligently to address. According to the top experts, the Republicans plan to hold the full faith and credit of the United States hostage in order to force huge, unnecessary, and arbitrary cuts would potentially put the country on the brink of a recession, cost millions of jobs, and hurt us all. Meanwhile, House Democrats favor protecting public safety and improving public health, lowering costs for families and students, and supporting seniors and veterans. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The chair now recognizes Mr. Fry from South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having this hearing today, and thank you, Mr. Dodaro, for being here. The American people deserve to know where their money is being spent. I've talked with a lot of my constituents since being in Congress, and I know that they are hurting financially. We see that in inflation and other things. They have to decide right now between gas in the tank or groceries in the fridge. They have to say no to a lot of things right now. That is why it's so hard to look at this high-risk list. It makes me disappointed, it makes me frustrated, and I know that these big agencies and programs are prone to risk. They need to be good stewards of the taxpayer dollars. If the American people have to cut back on spending, why not the United States government too? Why not reform the way that we operate our agencies to account for the American taxpayer? I represent the 7th District in South Carolina, home to South Carolina's finest beaches and golf courses. It's a premier retirement destination. That being said, I also represent a lot of people who are on Medicare. In fact, my district has the highest population of Medicare beneficiaries in the state, with over 201,000 people enrolled. Mr. Dodaro, I want to talk about Medicare today, which again makes the GAO's high-risk list for, what, the 3rd decade, I think, at this point in a row. The improper payments going out under Medicare total nearly $81 billion. That's roughly 15% of the total costs of Medicare. I bet Americans would love to have a little piece of that back. So I get it. Medicare is a giant program with things going on. They slip through the cracks. In fiscal year 2022, $47 billion of Medicare funds were improperly paid out. Mr. Dodaro, where is that money going?
I'll ask Ms. Farb, our healthcare expert, to respond.
So a large portion of the improper payment rate that's calculated by the agency is driven by lack of documentation. So it's hard to know if the payment was made improperly, meaning it should be returned, so there's a monetary loss, or if there just was a lack of documentation. For example, a clinician didn't provide the information needed to approve the claim. So one of the things we've recommended in the past is that CMS take a look at the documentation requirements for clinicians and try to balance the idea of not overburdening clinicians, but also making sure that documentation, requirements are easy to meet.
How much do you think is being distributed to fraudsters who are intentionally trying to rip off the federal government?
I don't have an estimate of the exact amount of fraud, but we can get back to you on that for the record.
But there's definitely cases that have been brought. In fact, most recently, within the last year, I think one of the biggest fraud in the Medicare program has been done by the Department of Justice under the task force. We get you, clearly, there are big cases of fraud involving a number of people.
Right, thank you. And how much, would you say that most of the money is because of improper payments from clerical errors or otherwise? Is that where most of the loss is?
It can be going to ineligible people. It could be going to ineligible providers. It could be going to the wrong amount. Most of this is overpayments. Some of it's underpayments, but it's a very small percentage going to underpayments. But the frustrating part, as Ms. Farb mentioned, is that in a lot of cases, there's just no documentation to tell. And, if you were audited by the IRS, they'd want to have your documentation. But a lot of the people in the federal agency said, well, it's just a documentation problem. Well, I said, we should have the same requirement when we're spending money to make sure you can adequately explain to us why you're spending that money. As if you're getting audited by the IRS. So that's a problem too.
How do you think that we can prevent this? I mean, what are some steps that can be taken, these agencies can take regarding Medicare to make measurable progress here?
Yeah, well, they need to, they'll need to do more audits of Medicare Advantage providers. They're way behind in those audits. They still haven't released the audits from 2011 to 2015. And Jess, you want to add?
Well, also, they should allow the recovery audit contractors to conduct prepayment reviews. They get a percentage of post-payment reviews of this pay and chase model we were talking about earlier. But if they were allowed to do prepayment reviews and more of that, then that would help. And Congress has to give them some of that authority.
Yeah.
What changes or strategies that have been implemented in other agencies or programs to remove that agency from the high-risk list would be useful to the Medicare program if they were to apply?
Well, one would be to continue to have an action plan to deal with these issues with goals and measures. Like, they don't really have a goal right now that I'm aware of anyway, where they would reduce the improper payment to a certain level. And one of the problems that we have is that you need to have a goal to know whether you're making progress or not. Now, they have been bringing down the improper payment rate, even though those are big numbers yet, in the Medicare program. The Medicaid program is going the other way. And that's, to me, a bigger problem in Medicaid than there is in Medicare right now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The chair recognizes Mr. Moskowitz from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Dodaro, good to see you again. I want to turn your attention to a high-risk area that is not necessarily on your list, but it's an issue that the GAO has published a number of reports about, and that is the risk of defaulting on our national debt. Mr. Dodaro, what would happen if the United States defaulted on our national debt?
I think it would have relatively catastrophic effects. One of the reasons that, the federal government, where the dollar is the reserve standard, is because we have most of the most liquid markets, treasury markets in the world. And that provides a lot of safe, reliable investments on the part of a number of people. That's why a lot of reserve banks in other countries purchase treasuries. And I think, we're borrowing such large amounts of money at a high pace that if we defaulted on our debt, I think we'd have a very difficult time convincing other people to borrow us. I mean, if you lend money to somebody and they didn't pay you back in time, would you give them more money? And we're pretty dependent on having.
Do you want me to answer that? I can.
Yes, just that's fine. But I've been trying for at least 6 years now, maybe longer, to try to get the way we set the debt ceiling changed. I think the way we have it now, we're only one of 2 countries in the world that do this. The other one's Denmark, and they set their debt limit so high they'll probably never get there. This is a problem. Right now, people, and what we've seen around these debt impasse periods is that people stop purchasing treasuries that might mature around a date, that there may be a potential default on this, so it distorts the treasury markets. It causes us...
Even
Yeah.
before a
Right.
default.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Well, and also you see, given the interconnected nature of our markets now, let's take, for example, just Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank, 2 relatively small banks in the scheme of things, but even there can have potential systemic repercussions. So I think a default would have enormous repercussions here and would affect not only our economy, but have ripple effects throughout the world.
Yeah, and since 1960, the debt ceiling has been raised 78 times, 49 times under Republican presidents, 29 times under Democratic presidents, 18 under Ronald Reagan, 8 times under Bill Clinton, 7 times under George W. Bush, 5 times under Barack Obama, 3 times under Donald Trump. And, this debt ceiling brinkmanship that we go into, I want to talk about how damaging, you think that is as well. Just this continued conversation that we always have to have because the debt ceiling is used as leverage for other issues.
Yeah. Well, it hasn't yet ever changed the trajectory of the long-term path of the federal government, which I've reported is on an unsustainable fiscal path. But it does raise the interest rates that people want to have to borrow us money. So in addition to distorting the liquidity, affecting the liquidity in the treasury markets and people avoiding purchasing treasuries, it costs us more money in the short run to borrow additional money. So it's really not, an effective way. Like, for example, we've recommended that the debt ceiling be raised at the time Congress makes the appropriation decisions, so it's done as a unified basis, or that Treasury have the ability to raise the debt ceiling whenever it's needed based upon the laws that Congress has already passed. All it does now is allow Treasury to borrow the money that Congress has already authorized and the President signed into law.
Right, and we hear from our colleagues about the economy and the fall of the dollar and the fact that the dollar is the currency for the world and the rise of China, and we have a China Select Committee. Nothing, in my opinion, could be more fuel for the rise of China and the fall of the United States in the eyes of the world than defaulting on our debt. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I do. But it will have economic but reputational consequences that will be felt for years if we ever defaulted, and I hope we never do.
No, thank you. I yield back.
The chair now recognizes Ms. Luna from Florida.
For those of you tuning in, each Congress, the Government Accountability Office provides a list of programs and operations that are susceptible to fraud, waste, and abuse management or needs improvement. As of 2023 in April, there were 37 areas on the high-risk list, one of which was improving federal oversight on food safety, which is an area that still needs major improvement after being added to the list back in 2007. In the United States, the safety and quality of food is overseen by around 30 federal laws and are administrated by 15 federal agencies. One major area of concern is food safety, is the use of food dyes, which have been linked to hyperactivity, behavioral issues in children, including an increased risk of certain cancers and other health problems. This is because the food dyes that they're using are derived from petroleum and often contain chemicals that are toxic to the body. Other countries like the United Kingdom have taken the safety and quality of food so seriously that they have banned dyes like Red 40, Yellow 5, and Yellow 6 food colorings because of safety concerns. Another area of concern for food safety is the importation process for foods, which are regulated by several agencies, including the FDA and the USDA. I recently was able to visit a port where I witnessed the importation process firsthand and realized that in the instance of seafoods, they're not always tested when they arrive at our ports, which is a huge problem because studies have shown that China's seafood farms, which produce about 80% of